Chapter 377. Luchin laughed and said, "You are so fat. Whether you believe me or not, you still look like a pig." Old Ma spat, then waved his hand and said, "Don't give me that. I have been looking for you for the past few years. His Excellency has also given orders to Fiyunji to carefully search for your whereabouts, but they have not been able to find you. Where have you been hiding?" Luchin thought for a moment and said, "I went to the south." Old Ma made a sound of agreement and said, "I think so too. In this world, the only place that can escape from Fiyunji and the evil cult is the chaotic land of chaos." Luchin was silent for a moment and said, "Damn, Baldy is still looking for me?" Old Ma seemed to sense something and his expression became serious. He looked at Luchin and said, "I have already told you that when you were suddenly chased by the people of Fiyunji while you were escaping, it was because the evil cult used a spy hidden in Fiyunji to give false orders. That is why it was a misunderstanding." Luchin's expression did not change much. He only said, "When did you find out?" Old Ma said, "It was His Excellency who felt something was wrong and secretly ordered me to go to Fiyunji to investigate. Then I found out about this." He glanced at Luchin with a hint of worry on his face. Even his voice had become a little deeper as he said, "You know me. I've never lied to you about something like this in all these years." Luchin slightly lowered his head, his expression indifferent. Old Ma could not tell what he was thinking at this moment, or whether he believed his words. After a while Luchin asked again, "How did that damned Baldy react when he found out about this?" Old Ma immediately said, "After True Monarch heard about this, he was furious and immediately punished Fiyunji heavily. He carefully sifted through them from top to bottom, and even Shuang was killed. Let me tell you, I've followed True Monarch for so many years, but this is the first time I've seen him so angry. If Shuang wasn't his trusted aide who had followed him longer than me, and had always been loyal to him, risking her life for so many years, I'm afraid she wouldn't even be able to keep her position as the Hall Master of Fiyunji." Luchin remained silent for a short while before he said, "I never expected him to have such a huge reaction." Old Ma said, "Luchin, the True Monarch really thinks highly of you." Luchin raised his head and looked at Old Ma. After a moment he smiled. "Later I'll send a secret report about your return and let True Monarch know that you're back." Luchin picked up the wine cup on the table in front of him, rubbed it for a while but did not drink. He only said, "So urgent? Maybe there's no need to tell him so urgently." Old Ma frowned, looked at Luchin and said, "Do you have something in mind?" Luchin shook his head and said, "No, I just want to live a peaceful life this time." "Without True Monarch's protection, you won't have a peaceful life at all." Old Ma pointed out this fact to Luchin mercilessly and straightforwardly. He said, "You've offended too many people and the power of your enemies is too great. There are also many madmen who don't care about their own lives, and they have remarkable abilities. If you don't have a backer and only rely on your own strength, it will be very difficult for you to live comfortably." Luchin gave a wry smile and said, "You don't have to say it so clearly." Old Ma sneered and said, "Everything about you is good, but sometimes your thoughts are too complicated, and you are too suspicious. You don't believe anyone. If I don't tell you directly, you will most likely think about it by yourself." These words of Old Ma were very serious, but Luchin did not get angry. He just drank the wine in his cup in one gulp, then nodded and said, "You are right, but this temperament was developed when I was in the Devil's sect. If I didn't do this, open my eyes even when I was asleep, be on guard every day and constantly calculate, I'm afraid I wouldn't have lived until now." Old Ma suddenly stopped talking. After a long while he gave a wry smile, and there was a hint of bitterness in his smile. He stood up and lightly patted Luchin's shoulder, but for a moment he did not know what to say. Luchin raised his head and looked at him, then suddenly smiled and said, "Come on, don't give me this kind of face, it makes me look like I'm going to die soon." Old Ma laughed and covered the bitterness on his face, then after a moment of silence, he still straightened his expression and looked at Luchin seriously and said, "To be honest, Luchin, listen to me, go back to the Immortal City with me and see the Supreme. I don't dare, and I don't have the qualifications to promise you, but I feel that the relationship between the two of you is definitely not what you think it is. You have to believe him." Old Ma said to Luchin softly but very seriously. "Believe him?" Luchin thought for a while, then slowly nodded. "Then let's go back to the Immortal City together?" "Okay, when are we leaving?" Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "It's better to be safe. I'll first send a secret report to the Supreme of the Immortal City and let him send someone to make arrangements, so that there won't be any accidents on the way." He glanced at Luchin and said, "You know there aren't many people in this world who can cause more trouble than you. Lu Chen rolled his eyes at him and said, "Okay then, you make the arrangements, I'm going out for a walk." Old Ma said, "Hey, are you really going out for a walk? Don't tell me you're going to disappear without a trace after leaving the door?" Lu Chen sneered and said, "You're crazy, can't you be more normal? You believe everything I say, don't you trust me that much?" Old Ma said sternly, "You shadows are not normal people. Get lost." Lu Chen felt that his emotions were unusually complicated. He was a little relaxed but also a little worried and uneasy. No matter how he thought about it, it was probably because he still couldn't see through that damn baldy. But who cares, things were like this. Actually, some of what old Ma said was very right and very reasonable. From the beginning until now, he never had much of a choice. He had always been tied to that damn baldy's pirate ship. If he didn't follow him, didn't believe him, what else could he do? Lu Chen strolled in the direction of the tea mountain. When he reached the foot of the tea mountain, he quickly saw the straw hut that he used to live in. Most of the people in this Qingshitang village lived in the village. Back then, he was the only one who lived at the foot of the mountain. As for the reason, it was actually very simple. Every night, there would be a mournful sound of the wind that sounded like ghosts wailing and wolves howling. Not many people could bear it. Lu Chen felt a sense of familiarity as he looked at the lush greenery of the mountain and the familiar light aroma of tea drifting in the wind. He looked around and thought to himself, could this be the legendary feeling of homecoming? He slowly walked to the side of the straw hut. No one had lived in it for a few years and it was very dilapidated. More than half of the thatch was gone, and the rest seemed to have rotted. The door was tightly shut, but there was a hole in the wall next to it. He didn't know who did it. Lu Chen walked over and pushed the door open. With a low squeak, the door slowly opened. A slightly moldy smell filled the air in the straw hut. Then there were those familiar things. Lu Chen stood at the door for a while. He looked up and saw that it was a dilapidated place. However, it wasn't like before where a piece of thatch gently fell. It was like the time that he had spent in the past 10 years, which was finally gone forever. Lu Chen smiled and turned to leave. Then he walked up the tea mountain. On that mountain, Atsu should still be waiting for him. There was also a woman who was sleeping here. He also wanted to visit her. Let's just take it as a farewell to that period of time, if she's really watching from the heavens. Chapter 378. On the way up the mountain, Lu Chen saw some traces beside the thatched hut and the edge of the forest. He was reminded of the tragic battle that happened on the last night he was here. Now that time had passed, those traces had become smaller and fainter. Lu Chen immediately recalled the time when he walked into Qingshitang village. He clearly remembered that the pursuit had affected the village, and that people had set many places on fire. However, the traces of the battle had basically disappeared this time. Everything had been covered up by new people, new houses, and new lives. Only the foot of the mountain far away from the village, a remote place where few people came, still had some traces of the battle. Lu Chen's gaze lingered on the traces by the roadside for a moment, then he walked up the tea mountain. In front of him was still a mountain full of green tea trees. When the mountain wind blew, the green leaves converged into a green ocean, undulating up and down. Countless spirit tea trees grew on this mountain peak. Everything was green as far as the eye could see. This also made the roads here extremely complicated and confusing. However, this was not a problem for Lu Chen. He had lived here for 10 years and he had walked up and down this tea mountain countless times. He could walk the roads here even with his eyes closed. He walked much faster than a few years ago, probably because he had recovered a lot of his cultivation. Soon he reached the top of the mountain. There were forks in front of him, each leading in a different direction. One was the sinkhole, the other was the dragon lake. Lu Chen naturally walked towards the dragon lake. The mountain breeze that blew against his face gradually brought with it a trace of moisture. As he walked closer, the sound of water could be heard from the front. Lu Chen was slightly startled. In his memory, although the dragon lake at the top of the mountain was not small, the water was calm all year round. Even the tides were very weak. Other than some ripples in the mountain breeze, there was almost no other sound. When the weather was good, the scenery here was also extremely beautiful. It could be said to be worthy of the praise of the green mountains, clear waters, and smooth as a mirror. However, Lu Chen quickly thought of something. He frowned slightly and quickened his pace towards the dragon lake. Not long after, he walked to the edge of the dragon lake. Sure enough, he saw a huge black dog playing around in the beautiful dragon lake. It dived into the water for a while, came out for a while, and then slapped the water with all its might. The water splashed everywhere and it was very lively. It was having a lot of fun. Lu Chen shook his head helplessly. He walked to the edge of the dragon lake and shouted towards the water, "Atsu, come up. Atu glanced at him and shook its head. It looked like it was unwilling to do so. Lucian coughed, then said solemnly, "Come back, there are demon beasts in the dragon lake. I heard that there is a very powerful and vicious fish." As he spoke, Lucian paused for a moment and then subconsciously recalled. It seemed that when he was still here a few years ago, someone seemed to have mentioned this to him. However, too many things happened after that and a long time had passed. He actually couldn't remember it clearly. After hearing Lu Chen's words in the dragon lake, Atsu was stunned at first, then it barked at him twice, and actually swam towards him very obediently. This time even Lu Chen was a little surprised. He didn't expect this stupid dog to be so obedient today. Originally he thought that this time, it would probably take a long time to trick this big dog to come back. He didn't expect that with such a casual talk Atsu would actually come back. Atsu swam all the way back to the shore and then jumped onto the shore. Before Lu Chen could walk away, the big black dog's whole body shook violently. Suddenly, water splashed like rain, drifted in the air, and then fell with a pitter-patter. Lu Chen jumped away, glared at the stupid dog and then turned to walk forward. Very quickly, he saw the grave that was piled up on the shore of the dragon lake. Yellow soil and rubble were mixed together, without a tablet, as if the person inside did not leave a trace in this world. Even her name had been blown away by the wind, never to be seen again. Who would still remember her beauty in the past? That woman who stood under the peach tree facing the wind, with thousands of light pink petals falling like rain, her smile like a flower. Then, like rain and wind, she scattered and scattered, disappearing from the world. Lu Chen stood in front of this nameless grave for a while and then sat down. He sat next to the grave, looking at the gradually calming dragon lake and the open and clear sky in front of him. The surroundings were very quiet, the world looked very beautiful, and everything seemed so perfect. He was like a good friend that he hadn't met for a long time, sitting side by side looking at the world, and then he smiled, using his hand to lightly pat the stone beside him, saying, "I've come to see you, Ding Dang. Actually, sometimes I think if you didn't die back then, what kind of relationship would we have?" Lu Chen looked into the distant sky, as if he was chatting with a beautiful girl who was currently smiling and sitting beside him, quietly listening to him speak. With a trace of a faint smile, he said, "Actually, I thought about many results and sometimes I thought it was very beautiful. But later on, I gradually realized that I was actually lying to myself." He touched the silent grave and softly said, "If you didn't die, I think the two of us wouldn't have a good ending. Either I let you down or I harmed you." He smiled, but his smile was a bit bitter, saying, "You see, I was a bit angry at you back then, angry that you didn't want to be infatuated with me and chose someone else. But now that I think about it, not choosing me was actually very good. Although you were also blind, choosing another scum. AI, so you caused your own death. You're such an idiot." At this time, Atsu walked over from the side, curiously circling around Lu Chen twice, and then sniffing the ground around him, seeming to be a bit interested in the grave beside him. But very quickly, Lu Chen reached out a hand and hugged its dog head, saying, "This is a very important friend of mine, you must respect her a bit." With its head clamped by Lu Chen, Atsu did not have any intention of resisting, and instead conveniently laid down, snuggling up to Lu Chen's side. Only when its gaze swept over the pile of yellow soil, it still couldn't help but be curious. Lu Chen shook his head and softly said, "Things of the past, even if I told you, you wouldn't understand, so I won't say it." Woof. On this day, Lu Chen stayed by the dragon lake on the Tea Mountain for most of the day. He only came down the mountain when the sky was getting dark and returned to the small pub. As soon as he entered the door, Old Ma came up to him, pulled him in and then closed the door, saying, "Why are you only back now?" Lu Chen was not bothered and said, "I went up the mountain for a walk and looked at the scenery in the past." "What's wrong?" Old Ma said seriously, "I've already reported your matter, and I used the most secretive and fastest secret channel. Stay here tonight, at most in another 8 to 10 hours, the perfected cultivator might come back with news." Lu Chen was shocked and said, "So fast? That's not possible unless that damned Baldy is near Qingshitang village. Otherwise, from what I know, it would take at least 2 to 3 days for you to pass the news to Fiyunji, right?" Old Ma chuckled and said, Hee, that's a secret, but I can tell you that as long as I find the perfected cultivator, there is a special supernatural power that is extremely fast." Lu Chen looked at him and suddenly laughed and nodded, "All right, I'll wait here and see what that damned Baldy thinks of me, and if he will like me coming back." Chapter 379. It was already dark and the mountain village was quiet. Most of the villagers had fallen asleep. Except for the faint starlight in the sky, the village at the foot of T Mountain was dark. Only this small tavern still had some inconspicuous light. Lu Qin and Old Ma sat opposite each other and drank. They opened the window and looked at the night sky outside. The cold night wind blew in from outside, causing the candles placed on the table to flicker. It also reflected on their faces, making them look gloomy. Old Ma walked over and closed the window. The howling wind suddenly subsided, and the tavern became quiet. Then he turned to Lu Qin and said with a smile, "In the 10 years we lived here, we often sat here and drank like this in the middle of the night. Now that I think about it, it seems like a long time ago." Lu Qin thought for a moment and said, "It has been a long time. I remember that we drank like this many times in the first 3 or 4 years when I first came here. At that time my mind was unsettled and I was injured. I always felt angry and irritated." Speaking of this, he pondered for a moment, but picked up the wine glass in front of him and raised it to Old Ma. "Thank you." Old Ma sat opposite him and said, "Thank me for thanking me for nothing." Lu Qin said, "Thank you for drinking with me and chatting with me in those days. Even when I scolded you for no reason, you tolerated it. Was not easy." He smiled as if laughing at his old self. Then he raised his glass to Old Ma and drank it in one gulp. Old Ma looked a little relieved. He smiled and nodded. He also picked up his glass and took a sip. Then he said to Lu Qin, "It was so long ago and you still remember it. It's just a small matter, not worth mentioning." Lu Qin was silent for a moment, and his face showed a little seriousness. He said to Old Ma, "I have almost no relatives in this world, and the only friend I can talk to is probably you. Therefore I have always kept these things in mind." Old Ma was startled. He was probably surprised by Lu Qin's words. But very quickly he lowered his head so that no one could see his expression. After a while he suddenly raised his head with a smile and said to Lu Qin, "If you really want to repay me, why don't you repay the debts you owed me years ago? Drink." Lu Qin picked up the wine pot on the table and filled Old Ma's cup. He smiled and said, "We haven't seen each other for a long time. Don't mention those unhappy things." Old Ma was speechless. "I have something to ask you," Lu Qin said to Old Ma. Old Ma nodded and said, "Yes, go ahead." Lu Qin was silent for a moment and said, "After the full moon night of the Kunlun party, I escaped from Kunwu City and fled all the way to the end of the world. I have never returned to Mount Kunlun. After I left, how was the situation in Mount Kunlun?" Old Ma looked at him and said, "Do you want to know about the situation of the Kunlun party and Lord Perfected, or do you want to ask about the other people under them?" Lu Qin smiled and then he said, "I can't hide anything from you. Tell me about it." "Yes." Old Ma paused for a moment, probably thinking about how to organize his words. After a moment he said, "The Kunlun party still suffered some damage. The most important thing is, of course, the sudden death of Hakushin Jinkuin, one of the 2 deity transformation stage perfected cultivators in the past. This is a loss that can't be made up for in any case. But no matter what, there is still another deity transformation stage perfected cultivator in the Kunlun party. As long as perfected cultivator Tianlan is there, no one in the world dares to look down on the Kunlun party. So in general the Kunlun party hasn't changed much. Life has to go on. Even if one of the legendary spring, summer, autumn and winter peaks suddenly crashed and destroyed, no more disasters happened to the Kunlun party. But now, on Mount Kunlun, perfected cultivator Tianlan's words are basically the law." Lu Qin frowned and said, "What about the original sect master, perfected cultivator Idle Month? She's in seclusion. She said that she's seriously injured and can't attend to matters." Old Ma's lips curled into a sarcastic smile. He pointed his finger at the sky above Lu Qin's head and said, "I heard that perfected cultivator Idle Month's injury is so serious that she needs at least 10 years of seclusion to recover. So now, even the position of sect master is held by the former first seat of Baichao Tang of the Kunlun party, perfected cultivator Chen Deng." Lu Qin looked at him and Old Ma also looked at Lu Qin. They looked at each other for a moment, then shook their heads slightly. After a while Old Ma said again, "As for the rise and fall of power in the Kunlun party, you can probably imagine it. It's nothing more than a change of ruler, a change of courtiers. Now the disciples originally from Hakushin Jinkuin's faction are suppressed and silent, while the disciples from Baichao Tang or other factions close to perfected cultivator Tianlan are incomparably glorious." Lu Qin suddenly seemed to think of something and said, "The glorious ones are Baichao Tang. Are there other factions close to the Dam Baldi? At this point he still hasn't accepted a personal disciple in the sect?" Old Ma glanced at him and shook his head. "No. In fact, a few years ago I really heard that many people had this idea. In such a big Kunlun party, I don't know how many young talents want to be perfected cultivator Qianlan's disciple, but in the end he declined one by one. To this day he still doesn't have any official disciples. Lu Qin thought for a moment and then said, "The damn Baldy has a bad temper. It seems that he is destined to live alone." Old Ma glared at him and opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something. But in the end he still wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. He could only smile bitterly. Lu Qin also ignored him and said, "Don't just talk about the damn Baldy. Is there any news about other people?" Old Ma snorted and said, "Boy, just say it directly. Who do you want to ask about? Otherwise how would I know what to say?" Lu Qin's fingers rubbed the wine glass for a moment, then he smiled and said, "It's none other than those I know. Just tell me." Old Ma was silent for a moment and said, "In recent years, perfected cultivator Tianlan has focused on cultivating the new talented disciples in the sect and doesn't have too many sectarian views. Therefore, the original talented people in the Kunlun party have become more brilliant, and there are also a few new people who have risen later. Su Qingjun is the most famous one. Her cultivation is brave and vigorous. Together with He Yi, she is known as the most outstanding disciple of the next generation of the Kunlun party. In Kunwa City, the Su family is also becoming more and more famous." Lu Qin looked at the wine glass in front of him in silence. After a long time he nodded and said, "Yes, she's not bad. Based on my understanding of her, she should have achieved such achievements." Old Ma said indifferently, "These years the Su family has spent a lot of money to search for the murderer who killed their young master." Lu Qin raised his head and looked at him. After a moment he suddenly smiled. Old Ma said, "So, boy, it's right that you didn't go back to Kunlun Mountain first. If you go back, you will definitely be discovered, and then what awaits you is the scene of the righteous and devil sects hunting you down in the past." Lu Qin waved his hand and said, "Don't worry about it. This kind of thing will be controlled by that damned Baldy." After a pause he asked again, "What about the others?" Old Ma said, "Who do you want to ask? How is that little girl, White Lotus?" "Oh, her? She seems to be living a good life. I heard that she has always stayed by perfected cultivator Tianlan and has never left." Lu Qin's eyes suddenly flashed. He looked up and said in a deep voice, "Damned Baldy wants to take White Lotus as his disciple?" Chapter 380. Old Ma was stunned for a moment, then he shook his head and said, "I haven't heard of that. I don't think so." Lu Qin looked at him for a while, then nodded and said nothing more. Old Ma looked at the night outside the window and asked casually, "By the way, I've always wanted to ask you something. What happened to the black dog? I remember that you took it away and I don't know where it went. What happened to it now?" Lu Qin was a little surprised and a smile appeared on his face. He said, "You still remember Atsu?" "Of course, how could I not remember?" Old Ma said with a smile, "That dog can eat very, very much." Lu Qin said with a smile, "It still follows me, but there have been some changes in the past few years. It has grown a lot. I'm afraid that bringing it into this village will scare other people, so I let it wait outside." Old Ma was a little surprised and said, "Atsu actually follows you. That's not bad. Bring it over and let me have a look. I haven't seen it for a few years and I kind of want to see it." Lu Qin nodded with a smile and said, "No problem. I'll go and have a look later." The two chatted in the tavern, drinking and talking about the past. A long time passed unknowingly. In the dead of night, Old Ma suddenly got up and left the tavern. After about half an hour he came back and went straight to Lu Qin. Lu Qin looked at him and said, "What's wrong?" There was a smile on Old Ma's face. He seemed to be in a good mood. He said joyfully, "I have received a reply from Lord Perfected Immortal. He is very happy and wants to see you very much. However, he is now in the Divine City and has too many trivial matters to deal with. He really can't leave, so he asked me to take you to the Divine City to meet him." "Going to Immortal City?" Lu Qin murmured. Old Ma said with a smile, "It's not like you haven't been to that place before. Why don't you dare to go?" "That's not it." Lu Qin sighed with emotion. He smiled with a complicated expression and said, "That's a good place." Lu Qin did not ask Old Ma how he could contact Immortal Tianlan from such a long distance in only a few hours. This should be a secret that only Old Ma knew. However, after deciding to return to the Immortal City, Old Ma quickly began to prepare. After daybreak he had already prepared everything that he needed to bring. On the other hand, Lu Qin had been sitting there leisurely from the beginning to the end, even though he looked empty as if he had brought nothing with him. Old Ma was a little confused, so he asked Lu Qin, Where's your luggage? Lucian smiled and said, I'm used to wandering around alone, so I don't usually bring too many things. Old Ma did not seem to believe what he said, but Lucian did not wait for him to think too much. He dragged him out and said, Let's go, I'll bring you to see Atsu. Old Ma looked at him, nodded, and did not say anything else. The two of them walked out of Qingshitang village when there were not many people in the morning. The official road outside the village stretched forward. The two of them walked on the road, and before long, without Lucian calling out to anything, they saw a black shadow jump out of a nearby hill and run towards them. The shadow got closer and closer, and its body grew larger and larger. Old Ma was a little surprised at first, but after hearing the dog barking and seeing Lucian's calm look, he immediately reacted and said to Lucian in surprise, Atsu? Yes, that's it. Lucian nodded. Good fella. Old Ma's eyes were a little dazed as he saw the huge dog suddenly running towards them. Just by looking at its body, it was a little taller than both of them. Those ordinary beasts such as tigers and lions were simply like little kittens in front of this black dog. At this moment, Atsu also saw Old Ma, who was standing beside Lucian. It squinted its eyes, but it did not seem to have much of a reaction. Old Ma was a little annoyed and complained to Lucian, This fella is a little heartless. Back then, in Kunwa City at the foot of Mount Kunlun, you left it with me. I took care of it with all my might and never neglected its food and drink. I didn't expect that in just a few years, this dog would no longer recognize me. Lucian laughed and casually pushed Old Ma's shoulder. He jokingly scolded, You're actually arguing with an animal? Old Ma mumbled, Anyway, that's the logic. It's a pity that I had so many meat bones back then. Although it was complaining, it seemed like Atsu really did not remember Old Ma. Or perhaps it was because they had not met for a long time that this dog had forgotten most of its memories of Old Ma. In short, it was very cold. After complaining to Lucian for a while, Old Ma of course did not really care about it. In the afternoon they passed by Nansong Mountain. There was a cultivation sect on that mountain, which was the Thousand Autumns sect that had been controlling Qingshitang village for so many years. Within a radius of tens of miles, apart from the occasional cultivators from other sects that passed by, the Thousand Autumns sect was basically the ruler of this land. Looking at Nansong Mountain from afar, one could see the pavilions and pavilions. White clouds floated in the air, and it did indeed look like a fairy. Lucian glanced at the mountain and asked Old Ma, How's the Thousand Autumns sect doing lately? Are they still doing that shady business of cheating people of their spirit stones? Old Ma shrugged. They've never stopped. As he spoke, he looked at Lucian. A strange light flashed in the depths of his eyes, but he still wore a smile on his face. He asked casually, Why, you don't like them? Lucian looked at the beautiful scenery on the mountain in the distance. After a moment of silence he said, I don't really like what this sect does, but I'm afraid that most of the cultivation clans in the world are doing this, so I have nothing more to say. Old Ma laughed and nodded at Lucian. Then the two of them walked side by side. Black Dog, who was standing behind them, looked up at the mountain. By the way, did I tell you something else? Old Ma seemed to have suddenly remembered something. He pulled Lucian aside and said, I heard that in Immortal City nowadays, dogs are not allowed to be kept, or openly bring all kinds of pets on the streets. So, it's hard to say whether Atsu can follow you into the city. Lucian was stunned for a moment. Then he said in surprise, What kind of rule is that? I don't remember hearing about it before. Old Ma smiled and said, You really don't know. This happened just half a year ago. At that time, Immortal Chehu, one of the 6 immortals of the Alliance of True Immortals, suddenly opened his mouth and ordered that dogs were not allowed to be kept in the Immortal City. He even sent people to search the streets and killed countless dogs in a month. As he spoke, he turned to look at Black Dog and said, This dog of yours is frighteningly big. I'm afraid that no matter what, it will offend the guards of True Lord Tiehu. When it gets slaughtered and stewed, don't blame me for reminding you. Lucian nodded slowly and responded. Then he smiled and said, It seems that True Lord Tiehu has a lot of ideas. Even the Heavenly Law Hall doesn't seem to be enough to satisfy him. But to kill dogs in the city like this, no one came out to persuade him? Who would persuade him to do such a thing? Old Ma sneered. Lucian also laughed. Then he looked at the road in the direction of Immortal City in the distance. He wondered what he would encounter this time in Immortal City, which was known as the largest city in the vast land of the Divine Land. A true Lord of Deity stage who likes to kill dogs? Lucian thought to himself. Chapter 381. Huashan perfected cultivators were high and mighty figures in the cultivation world of the human race. They were revered by all. Every Huashan perfected cultivator's status was similar to that of a demigod. And in the Immortal City, or in the world's most powerful Zhangxianming, the 6 Huashan perfected cultivators could be said to be the most powerful figures. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were directly in charge of the life and death of all living beings. Since the status of Huashan perfected cultivators was so high, they naturally would not pay attention to some insignificant matters. Moreover, these perfected cultivators all had a large group of people following them. Naturally, there would be a large group of people helping them. Therefore, this was the first time in many years that Lu Qin had heard that a Huashan perfected cultivator would actually pay attention to the problem of whether there were many dogs in the Immortal City. It was a bit like a legendary dragon suddenly paying attention to an insignificant ant in the dust at its feet. This Tiehu perfected cultivator is a bit interesting. Lu Qin said to Old Ma as they hurried along. Have you seen him? Old Ma shook his head and said, I haven't seen him. The 6 perfected cultivators in the Immortal Alliance are all high and mighty figures. Other than this one from our own family, I don't have the qualifications or the opportunity to see them. Just a meeting. How can it be considered an opportunity? Lu Qin said disapprovingly. Then he pondered for a moment and said, but if there really is such a ban, it will be a bit troublesome. It won't be easy for Atsu to follow me into the city. Atu, who was following beside him, seemed to understand a little, and its large dog head came over to take a look. Lu Qin smiled at it and rubbed its head, saying, It's all right, if worst comes to worst, you can just wait for me outside the city. And it's not impossible. Wait for me to think of a way. Maybe I can bring you into the city. Then he glanced at Old Ma and said, According to what you said, there is not a single dog in such a large territory in the Immortal City? Old Ma immediately shook his head and said, Of course not. There were hundreds of millions of people in the Immortal City. Even if it was impossible for everyone to have a dog, there were still many dog lovers. After Tai Hu True Monarch's dog prohibition order was issued, many dogs were indeed hunted and killed. All kinds of dogs on the streets of Immortal City also disappeared for a while, but there are definitely still many dogs left in the city. Lu Qin raised his eyebrows slightly, looking a little curious. Smiling, he said, Seems like the Immortal City is indeed a place with crouching tigers and hidden dragons. There's actually someone who dares to ignore the ban of a soul formation perfected lord. And from what you said, it seems like there are quite a number of such people? Old Ma thought for a while and said, Not necessarily. After all, he is a perfected cultivator. Everyone has to be careful. But in the Immortal City, there are still quite a few people who still keep dogs. It's just that everyone is a little more restrained and no longer swagger their dogs on the streets like before. They keep them at home? Yes, they usually keep them at home and occasionally bring them out for a stroll. They just have to be careful. After all, the people who still keep dogs now have some status. Those guards who kill and ban dogs in the city mostly turn a blind eye when they see them. Lu Qin nodded and asked again, Then the dogs that were killed in the past? Old Ma sneered and said, Of course it's the dogs of those commoners. Oh, there were indeed quite a few wild dogs in the Immortal City, so they were all killed. In the past, there would often be incidents of mad dogs biting people in the Immortal City. You know, in that kind of place it's very easy to have mixed blood wild dogs and the like. Every year, there are actually quite a number of people who are bitten to death by mad dogs. But after Tai Hu True Monarch's ban was issued, the situation became much better. And then it seems that this ban is not completely without its benefits. Lu Qin said with some surprise. Old Ma laughed and said, You can say that. But this matter, we small characters and commoners take it seriously. People like Lord True Monarch definitely don't care about it. Maybe he will just casually give an order and then be too lazy to care. I heard that the people who carry out this ban under Tai Hu True Monarch have done some unbearable things and caused a lot of public anger. What do you mean? Lu Qin looked a little curious. Old Ma laughed and said, What else can it be? It's nothing more than those tricks of bullying the weak and fearing the strong and bullying the kind. These people don't dare to provoke the rich and influential families, but when it comes to bullying the commoners, they don't hesitate to come and catch the dogs. At the same time, there are also extortion and blackmail. I haven't been in the Immortal City these days, but I heard that because of this ban, there is a foul atmosphere and the people are boiling with anger. Lu Qin frowned and said, So bad? That Tai Hu True Monarch doesn't know about it? Old Ma shrugged and said, Lord True Monarch is a high and mighty person. Who knows how many things he has to do every day, he won't pay attention to such a small matter. Lu Qin's eyes flashed and after a moment he suddenly said, I don't know about the people under Tai Hu True Monarch, but the dead Baldy has a large number of people under him, especially Fiyunji, such a sinister and cunning hall. He definitely knows about it, right? Old Ma coughed and didn't say anything. Lu Qin snorted and revealed an as expected expression. Then he shook his head and didn't say anything. Along the way with this incident of dog ban mentioned by Old Ma unintentionally, Lu Qin asked Old Ma some things about Tai Hu True Monarch without batting an eyelid, as if it was incidentally. According to Old Ma, Tai Hu True Monarch was a highly respected big shot who was a little older than Tianlan True Monarch. But for Lu Qin this answer was meaningless because first of all Huashan True Monarchs were highly respected. If they didn't admit this they probably couldn't stay in Zhangxianmeng or the Immortal City any longer. In addition, the dead Baldi Tianlan was indeed a rare genius. Among the 6 true monarchs in Zhangxianmeng he was the youngest one. In other words, all the Huashan true monarchs were older than the dead Baldi. After being despised and questioned by Lu Qin, Old Ma had to search his memory again and told Lu Qin some things about Tai Hu True Monarch that he could think of in his daily life. In this way, it seemed that a more complete image of a Huashan True Monarch gradually became clear in front of Lu Qin. Needless to say, Tai Hu True Monarch was born in a famous cultivation sect, Tianluo True Monarch. In addition, this true monarch had a serious and cautious temperament. For many years he had always been fair, so he was in charge of the Hall of Heavenly Law, which was in charge of law and punishment in Zhangxianmeng. He was impartial and had always been respected by the world. Behind this true monarch was a rich and powerful family, and he also had several proud disciples, all of whom were outstanding geniuses in Tianluo sect. Under his command, the Hall of Heavenly Law had a very strong guard, which was said to be among the top 3 in the ranking of the various mountains in Zhangxianmeng. In short, he was basically an incomparably strong and superior big shot. In addition, at the last moment Old Ma said to Lu Qin calmly, "Well, I heard that this lord doesn't like our boss Tianlan True Monarch. They are like fire and water." Chapter 382. How so? These two are both spirit-severing true monarchs and they're both in Zhangxianmeng. How could their relationship be so bad? Lu Qin asked in surprise. Old Ma thought for a while and said, "I only know a little about the ins and outs of this matter. There are many things that only these two lords know. But as far as I know, Tai Hu True Monarch has been dissatisfied with Fiyunji for a long time. He often publicly said that our hall is a waste of money and is useless. Even Hall Master Shuiying has been criticized by him several times." Lu Qin nodded and revealed a trace of a smile on his face and said, "Shuiying must be very depressed, right? Isn't that so?" Old Ma laughed and said, "With Hall Master Shuiying's identity, she can actually be considered a big shot in the Immortal City. Ordinary people don't dare to provoke her. But Tai Hu True Monarch is not an ordinary person. And he is probably one of the few humans in the Immortal City that Hall Master Shuiying doesn't dare to provoke." "Damn, Baldi didn't stand up for his subordinates?" Lu Qin asked. Old Ma hesitated for a while and said, "This matter is actually not easy to handle. Tai Hu True Monarch only said a few words and didn't really make a move or suppress them. Then with his identity even our true monarch can't say much. After all, in terms of seniority Tai Hu True Monarch is a bit older." Speaking up to here, Old Ma sighed again and said, "But then again, these few years in Fiyunji has not been very smooth. Many things have gone wrong and people have seen them as a joke. In addition, the remnants of the devil sect are sinister and cunning. They are really hard to deal with. Those who don't know the inside story will often ridicule them." Lu Qin was silent for a while and suddenly sneered and said, "Ordinary people might be like this, but how can people who have reached the position of true monarch not know the inside story of this kind of thing? In my opinion, that Supreme Tai who most likely has other plans in his heart." Old Ma was stunned for a moment, then he nodded and said hesitantly, "Now that you mention it, it seems to make sense. When you reach the Immortal City and see Lord True Monarch, you might as well mention this to him." Lu Qin looked at him with a smile and shook his head. "Although this damned Baldi is sinister and cunning, with a belly full of evil tricks, in all these years, I've never seen anyone more powerful than him in both the righteous and evil Tao. So I think he probably knows about this kind of thing in his heart, he just doesn't want to say it." Old Ma laughed and nodded. "That makes sense. I didn't expect you to think so highly of Immortal even though you are usually dissatisfied with him." Lu Qin rolled his eyes and said grumpily, "Nonsense. Who in this world would look down on a divine transformation stage perfected cultivator? He's either a lunatic or a fool." Of course, Lu Qin and Old Ma were neither lunatics nor fools, so they quickly reached an agreement on this matter. At the same time, Luchin also casually asked Old Ma about the current situation in the Immortal City and Zhengxianming. Old Ma also told him everything honestly. It seemed that he did not hide anything from him. Although he was currently living in seclusion in the remote mountain village of Qingshitang village, and no one knew how long he had stayed here before Luchin appeared, but from the conversation between Luchin and Old Ma, it was obvious that this fatty Old Ma seemed to be very familiar with Zhengxianming, including the various forces and factions in the Immortal City, as well as the various undercurrents surging under the water surface. It was obvious that he was a person who had immersed himself in the Immortal City and Zhengxianming for a long time. Because of this, Luchin actually had a preliminary understanding of the various forces in Zhengxianming and Immortal City just by listening to Old Ma's narration during the past few days of travel. But in the end he still said to Old Ma very seriously, "Now I've memorized most of the things you said, so I have an idea of what to do. But right now I have two more important things to ask you." Old Ma smiled and said, "Ask away, I'll tell you everything I know. Don't worry." Luchin stretched out a finger and said, "First, although the damn Baldy didn't sit on the throne of the Kunlun Party's leader, his position in the Kunlun Party is almost unparalleled. It can be said that he has control of this famous cultivation sect, right?" Old Ma nodded and said, "Of course. Now, from the top to the bottom of the Kunlun Party, the only perfected cultivator in the soul formation stage can be said to be respected as a god." Luchin said faintly, "If that's the case, I find it strange. Why didn't the damn Baldy stay in the Kunlun Mountain and be a local tyrant? Instead, he insisted on coming to Immortal City to be squeezed by people. Maybe there's something dangerous." Old Ma frowned, hesitated for a moment and said, "In fact, it's not just what you said. After the master completely controlled the Kunlun Party, he began to gradually summon the talents of the Kunlun Party, including those Yuanying Jinren with profound cultivation, to Immortal City. Of course, on the surface he said that he had too many relatives and friends, but in the end many of these people were still placed under his sect. Well, there are no personal disciples, everyone is a registered disciple." Speaking of this, his eyes looked at Luchin with deep meaning, but Luchin didn't seem to notice Old Ma's eyes for a while, or maybe he didn't want to be entangled in this kind of thing at all. At this moment, his attention was completely fixed on another thing, and he looked extraordinarily focused. Luchin looked around and suddenly said, "You mean many of the young outstanding disciples of the Kunlun Party have come to Immortal City?" Old Ma nodded and said, "Yes, and these people basically only know how to respect him. Although Zhengxianming's intention is to incorporate these people into Fiyunji, now is probably not the time." Luchin snorted and said, "Using public resources for private purposes, this can be considered as using Zhengxianming's money to cultivate their own children." Old Ma smiled and said, "Isn't that so? But probably because of this, after Chehu Zhengxianming, who is in charge of Heavenly Law Hall, knew about this, he flew into a rage. His subordinates also suddenly became excited and began to stir up trouble. Once, they even took away a few people from Fiyunji, humiliated them by the river outside the city, and then ran away without leaving their names." Luchin glanced at him and felt that it was a little funny and said, "Since they didn't leave their names, why do you think that it was done by Tiehu Jinxiang's subordinates?" Old Ma shrugged and said, "When you stay in Immortal City for a long time, you will probably be familiar with the rules here." Luchin didn't care and just brushed over this issue and didn't talk about it anymore. Now he wanted to talk about another matter. "There is one more thing, Old Ma." "Say it." Old Ma replied. "Over the past few days I've heard about the True Immortal Alliance along the way. They're really worshipping them as if they're gods. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the Immortal City who are itching to make a move. But these are none of my business. I just want to ask you, what did the damn Baldy tell you? Such a long journey, he wouldn't really let only the two of us finish it, right?" Old Ma was startled for a moment, then nodded and said, "You really know Zhengxiangrely. In fact, after knowing our decision to return to Immortal City, Zhengxiangrely thought about us, and specially arranged people to protect us." "Who is it?" Luchin asked curiously. For some reason, Old Ma's expression looked a little subtle. After a while, he was heard coughing and said, "I heard that it is White Lotus." Chapter 383. Her again? Luchin was obviously startled. After a moment of silence, he said to Old Ma with a strange expression on his face, "If I remember correctly, White Lotus should be the last disciple of Hakushin Jinkuin in the past, right? That damn Baldy actually treats her differently, it really doesn't seem like his character." Old Ma shrugged and said, "Who knows? That little girl's identity has long been made public, at least in the Kunlun Party, everyone knows about it. But don't think too much about it. Although Perfected Immortal has always kept White Lotus by his side for the past few years, he has never officially announced that he wants to accept her as a disciple. Lucian shook his head, his face calm, and said, I won't think too much about it. I don't care who that damn Baldy wants to accept as a disciple. I just feel a little strange that he would actually keep Hakushin Jinkuin's disciple by his side. Old Ma smiled and said, when I first heard about this, I actually felt a little strange in my heart, but Perfected Immortal's heart is as deep as the sea, and his plans are far-reaching. It's not a big deal that I can't see through it. Lucian didn't immediately respond to him, but just walked forward in silence for a while. After a while, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, I have a guess about what that damn Baldy is thinking. Do you want to hear it? Old Ma's body paused and he turned to look at Lucian, only to see that Lucian had a gentle smile on his face. Old Ma looked at him for a while and then said, I don't want to hear it. After saying that, he continued to walk forward, leaving Lucian standing in the same place. Lucian's face finally revealed a trace of astonishment, but then he laughed and sped up his pace to catch up with Old Ma. Walking side by side with Old Ma, Lucian said with a smile, Damn fatty, I haven't seen you for a few years but you look a lot smarter. Bah. Old Ma spat at him then sneered, the superior is respected. Those who dare to pry into the private affairs of the venerable, especially those in our line of work, never live long. I'm still young. I don't want to die early. After that, Old Ma continued to walk forward without looking back. It seemed that he regarded Lucian as a snake or a scorpion. Lucian, on the other hand, didn't seem to mind and even laughed. He caught up with him in a few steps and said with a smile, That damned Baldy still thinks highly of you. What are you afraid of? Bullshit. Old Ma looked very annoyed and said grumpily, No matter what, I'm just a subordinate who runs errands for the immortal. It's our duty to abide by the rules and not overstep them. On the contrary, you are the one who has a close relationship with the immortal. You can say whatever you want, but I don't want to touch it at all. Lucian looked at him and said with emotion, Nowadays even you have become so smart. It's really hard to mix in the underworld of cultivation. Old Ma ignored him and just walked forward with his head down. Lucian stretched and said, How about this? I'll say a few words to myself now. Just let it go in one ear and out the other. After all, we have a good relationship. Old Ma remained silent, as if he had completely covered up Lucian's voice. However, Lucian could still clearly see through some slight movements of Old Ma's body that this guy was secretly stretching his ears to listen carefully. Lucian didn't care. He coughed and said after a moment of silence, Based on my understanding of that damned Baldy, if the infighting in the Kunlun party was really just a fight between him and Hakushin Jinkuin, then now he would never take care of Hakushin Jinkuin's disciples. Lucian nodded to the expressionless Old Ma next to him, and then said very clearly, He is not the kind of person who is magnanimous. In the past, when someone angered him, it would have been fine if it was an ordinary mortal, because that damned Baldy couldn't afford to find trouble with mortals. But if it was a cultivator who angered him, the result was usually not good. Old Ma coughed and said, Now, Lord Perfected Immortal has already cultivated his moral character, and his temper has become very good. Those things in the past will not happen again. Lucian sneered, obviously not believing what Old Ma said, and then said to himself, Because of this damned Baldy actually showed great kindness this time. There's something wrong. What's wrong? Old Ma couldn't help but ask. He must be buying people's hearts. Lucian said seriously, After that damned Baldy defeated Hakushin Jinkuin and took control of the Kunlun party, there must be many people watching what he did and they must be anxious. But as long as this news gets out, probably everyone will think that if this perfected immortal Tianlan can even take care of his senior brother's last disciple, isn't this very righteous? Old Ma coughed and then said seriously, Lord Perfected Immortal is really righteous, but this matter actually has nothing to do with that little girl named White Lotus, right? Lucian smiled and said, In addition to buying people's hearts, that damned Baldy kept White Lotus by his side to cultivate, there is probably one more important reason. Old Ma couldn't help but be curious and asked, What is it? She is a five-pillar genius. Lucian smiled, but when the smile was reflected in Old Ma's eyes, it seemed to be a little cold at that moment, and in his ears, Lucian's voice continued to echo, Such a genius is rarely seen in 1,000 years, and even if there is one, she may not be able to enter the Kunlun mountain. How could that damned Baldy give up such a chance? He smiled, looking very happy and gratified, and said to Old Ma with a smile, Don't you think so? Old Ma was in a daze for a while and suddenly turned around and strode forward, muttering at the same time, "What a mess, I'm confused." Lu Qin and Old Ma met White Lotus on the fourth day after they went out. On that day the sky was a little gloomy and it was almost dusk. Even Atsu, who was following them, looked a little sleepy. Lu Qin discussed with Old Ma to find a place to rest first, and then continue their journey the next morning. While they were chatting, Atsu, who was originally lying at Lu Chen's feet, suddenly quivered, and then its ears pricked up, it opened its eyes and looked forward. Lu Qin and Old Ma seemed to feel that something was wrong at this moment, and then they saw the last ray of sunset in front of them. The pale golden light sprinkled on the ground, and the leaves and weeds on both sides of the road seemed to be plated with a layer of golden light, shining beautifully and admirable. A girl in white appeared on the road in front of them, looking in Lu Chen's direction with a frosty expression. Lu Chen's eyes met hers, and for a moment he was also filled with emotions. He thought that if it wasn't for the bad luck, this girl in front of him might have fallen into the barbarian wasteland in the south with him. However, it was a little boring to think about these things now, so Lu Chen smiled and waved at White Lotus. White Lotus looked at him and then at Old Ma and finally slowly looked down and saw the big black dog lying next to Lu Chen. A huge black dog, which looked more like a demon beast than a domestic black dog, was lying there and looked like it was about to fall asleep. White Lotus suddenly shouted, "Stupid dog, how long has it been and you already don't recognize me?" Atsu's body suddenly trembled, and then it slowly raised its head, looking at the girl in white in front of it. After a moment, Atsu suddenly let out a whine, and a trace of fear appeared on its face. Chapter 384. There was a hint of surprise in Old Ma's eyes as he looked at White Lotus in front of him. He did not notice the abnormality of Atsu next to him. However, Lu Chen was different from him. He had been with this black dog almost every day for the past few years, so he noticed the abnormality of Atsu almost immediately. He could not help but frown. After Atsu's breakthrough a few years ago, Lu Chen rarely saw this kind of fear in him. Even when he ventured into the depths of the southern lands with Lu Chen in the future, Atsu was still carefree, roaming the world with ease. However, on this day when Atsu saw White Lotus, it suddenly showed this kind of abnormal emotion which surprised Lu Chen. Perhaps Atsu still remembered the encounter in Kunlun Mountain? A figure walked up from behind and stood in front of Atsu, blocking Atsu's sight. It was Lu Chen. He reached out his hand and touched Atsu's head. Atsu seemed to feel something and looked at him. The fear in its eyes quickly dissipated, and it became clear and calm again. Whether it was Lu Chen's hand or Atsu's fur, they were both warm. Lu Chen smiled and nodded to Atsu, then turned around and looked at White Lotus. After a few years, White Lotus was no longer the child she used to be. Today she was still delicate and beautiful, and her temperament was still pure and cold. She still gave people the feeling of an ice fairy. But it was undeniable that this girl was approaching, or should it be said that she was about to enter the most beautiful, brilliant, and dazzling youth of her life. Her body had grown a lot taller and she looked more and more slender. Her figure was gradually revealed, making people's eyes light up. It was as if this girl was born with a dazzling light that made people unable to ignore her, and subconsciously wanted to take a few more glances at her. Lu Chen nodded to her, showed a smile and said, "Long time no see." White Lotus's gaze fell on him, and there was a trace of hidden and very complicated expression in the depths of her eyes. When she was about to speak, suddenly all three people present heard a roar from behind Lu Chen. It was Atsu who poked its head out from behind Lu Chen. But this time the instinctive fear that Atsu showed when it saw White Lotus had completely disappeared. Instead, this big black dog seemed to be very annoyed. It bared its teeth and growled at White Lotus and even showed its fangs. It looked very angry, as if it couldn't wait to pounce on this beautiful girl to vent its anger. White Lotus probably didn't expect Atsu's expression and attitude to change so suddenly. She was stunned and said to Lu Chen, "What's wrong with you, stupid dog?" Lu Chen reached out and stroked Atsu's head. After thinking for a while, he said, probably angry out of shame, "White Lotus, holy beasts were powerful monsters." After advancing, they almost had no natural enemies, and there were not many enemies in the world that they were afraid of. Therefore, the sudden fear just now made Atsu very angry and annoyed. It felt that there was no need for it to be afraid of White Lotus at all. It felt that it had embarrassed itself. Therefore, for the rest of the journey, this big black dog no longer had a good attitude towards the beautiful girl, White Lotus. However, humans were heartless. None of the three people present would run to comfort this suddenly angry black dog. At most, Lu Chen gently stroked its head a few times. At the same time, his attention was still on White Lotus. "Why are you here?" Lucian asked White Lotus. White Lotus shrugged and said, I was ordered to come here. As she said that, she turned to face old Ma and took out a sealed envelope from her arms. She asked old Ma, Are you Ma Xiaoyun? Old Ma nodded and said, Yes. As he said that, he took out a piece of jade from his arms and handed it to White Lotus. White Lotus took it and looked at it carefully. Then, she nodded and handed it to old Ma along with the envelope in her hand. Old Ma took the jade and put it away first. Then he directly opened the envelope and read the letter inside carefully. Then he nodded and said, That's right. But in the letter, Lord Perfected Immortal ordered me to go with Lu Chen to the Immortal City. I will go with you. White Lotus grunted and did not seem to care. Her clear and lively eyes looked at Lu Chen and said, Let's go. Lu Chen smiled and said, Okay, let's go. How have you been these few years? Lu Chen asked White Lotus. White Lotus said, It's not bad. My biggest backer, Master, died, and in the end I found an even more powerful Uncle Master. I don't know how many people inside and outside the sect are envious of me. As she said that, she smiled at Lu Chen and said, What about you? I'm quite unlucky. Lu Chen said honestly, After you left, Atsu and I also went south to escape into the depths of the land of chaos. Our days were miserable and we only came back recently. White Lotus looked like she didn't believe it. She pointed at Atu and said, You must be talking nonsense. This stupid dog is 10 times fatter than before. How can it look like it's living a miserable life? This is obviously the appearance of a well-fed dog. Roar. Atsu let out a low growl and extended its fangs. It looked like it was trying to bite off White Lotus's white and delicate finger. White Lotus giggled as she retracted her finger. She didn't seem angry at all. She said to Lu Chen, This dog's temper has grown. I don't remember it being this angry when it was with you. Lu Chen smiled and said, Atsu is not like this usually. It is probably in a bad mood today. White Lotus thought about it and nodded without saying anything. Lu Chen changed the topic and at the same time he asked about the doubts in his heart. He said, What about you? What's the situation now? It seems like you are doing very well in the Kunlun party. Even that true Lord Tianlan treats you differently. White Lotus curled her lips and said, It's just Essos. There is nothing to boast about. Lu Chen asked, Shouldn't you be on the Kunlun mountain in the Westland? Why did you come to the Immortal City and were sent to pick me up? White Lotus said, My martial uncle Tianlan insisted that I follow him, and then he suddenly told me to come to pick you up not long ago. Speaking of this, White Lotus suddenly smiled and said, But I really did not expect that the person who can make a perfected cultivator of Huashan realm miss you and make me come to pick you up in person is actually you. Lu Chen said with a smile, That's really hard for you. White Lotus looked into his eyes, but there was no smile in her eyes. After staring at Lu Chen for a long time, she suddenly said, Who are you? Lu Chen said, I'm a former handyman disciple of the Kunlun party. You can't have forgotten this, can you? White Lotus snorted and said, What kind of handyman disciple can make a perfected cultivator of Huashan realm remember him and send someone to pick him up? There must be an important reason for him to think so highly of someone. Lu Chen smiled and said nothing. He just walked forward with Atsu. After a while, suddenly White Lotus's voice sounded a little cold. She said, Lu Chen, were you a spy that perfected cultivator Tianlan personally placed in the Kunlun party to inquire about information in the Kunlun mountain and do a lot of evil things? For example, my master and my eldest brother. Lu Chen's expression did not change. He still looked gentle and polite. He smiled at White Lotus and said, No, I don't know the person you are talking about, so these things have nothing to do with me. Really? White Lotus looked a little suspicious. Really? Lu Chen said with a smile and a nod. He looked very relaxed and there was no trace of lying. Chapter 385. What do you think of White Lotus as a person? This was the first question Lu Chen asked Old Ma when they chatted privately that night after they rested for the night. Because of safety concerns, they did not enter the cities and towns along the way, but directly slept in the wild. Fortunately, sleeping in the wild was not difficult for cultivators like them. At night, because of the difference between men and women, and because White Lotus was also a neat freak, or because she was not used to being too close to others, she hid far away and slept. Old Ma glanced at White Lotus in the distance. After making sure that she could not eavesdrop on his conversation with Lu Chen, he lowered his voice and said, It's okay. At least on the surface she is good to us. As for more, this is the first day we met so we can't see it. Lu Chen nodded slowly. After a moment he said, Didn't she say that the damn Baldy always kept her by his side? Why did he let her come out alone to pick us up this time? Old Ma shrugged and moved his fat body lying on the ground to make himself more comfortable. At the same time he said, no one knows. I think that besides Lord Immortal and White Lotus herself, there is probably no third person who can completely understand the relationship between them. However, since you asked this, I think that this time White Lotus came to pick us up. At least two things are clear. Luchin raised his eyebrows and moved closer to Old Ma. He asked with interest, oh? What two things? Tell me. Old Ma said lightly, first, Lord Immortal believes in her. Or it can be said that he has great confidence that White Lotus will not betray him, so he can let her come out alone to pick us up. Second, Lord Immortal values you very much, but he only secretly sent White Lotus for such an important matter. This means that this girl's cultivation is absolutely not what it used to be, and her strength must be abnormally strong. That is why Lord Immortal trusts her so much. Luchin was deep in thought. Old Ma looked at him and said with some bad intentions, what, are you afraid? In the past, Lord Immortal valued you so much, but you did not pay attention to him. Now that such a genius has suddenly appeared out of nowhere, do you know to be nervous? Luchin also laughed, shook his head and looked at White Lotus in the distance. He saw that the girl was sleeping with her clothes on, and seemed to have fallen asleep. He was silent for a moment and said, damn Baldy, this person is extremely intelligent, far-sighted and sophisticated. He is close to a demigod but not like a human, so it is very difficult to use ordinary people's point of view to guess him. In my opinion, at least in the current world, there is no one that he deeply trusts. This White Lotus is also the same. She is not qualified. Old Ma did not seem to agree with Lu Chen's words. He sneered and said, look at what you said as if it is true. Then tell me in the end, how can one be considered as Lord Immortal's considerate person? Lu Chen said indifferently, it's very simple. That damnable Baldy officially takes someone as a disciple and passes down the heaven character Taoist title passed down from generation to generation to that person. That person is someone that he truly regards highly and fosters with all his heart. Tian Taoist name? Old Ma seemed to be stunned for a moment. After a while he said, if it is to accept a disciple, White Lotus should be very promising. After all, her talent is too good. She is a rare five-pillar genius. Even Hakushin Jinkuin made an exception and accepted her as his last disciple. Lu Chen sneered and said, damn Baldy is not his dead senior brother, let alone him. In short, remember what I said, in the eyes of damn Baldy, everyone is probably the same as an ant. The most important thing is whether they are useful or not. As for saying that there is hope with him as a five-pillar genius, I don't know if White Lotus believes in this, but that is a lie. As he said this, Lu Chen looked up at the dark sky and slowly said, what is 5 pillars? It is necessary to use them. The journey was very smooth and there were no accidents. After a few days they safely arrived at the Yingxing River outside the Immortal City. From afar, they could already see the huge city in the vast and fertile Four Rivers plain in the distance. The Immortal City was now the well-deserved #1 city in the vast land of the Divine Land. Especially after Zheng Xianmeng settled here 1,000 years ago and put in effort to manage it, until today the prosperity of the Immortal City increased day by day. It attracted countless talents from aristocratic families and became the center of the land of the vast land. Unlike most of the cities in the vast land of the Divine Land, the Immortal City here, although there was the word city, there were no city walls. Countless buildings and palaces were built on this fertile land, forming a vast city that could not be seen at a glance. Here, people did not need the protection of the city walls, because the Immortal City itself was the most powerful force in the world. The Immortal City was backed by a mountain on one side and water on 3 sides. The 4 most famous rivers in the Four Rivers plain flowed through this huge city. In the early ancient times, it was said that there was an ancient relic here. Today, in the Immortal City, some remnants of the relic could occasionally be seen in some corners. Among them, the most eye-catching were of course in the east, south, west and north directions. There was a magnificent giant statue carved with the legendary azure dragon, white tiger, vermilion bird and black tortoise. These 4 statues of the holy beasts were all standing with their backs facing the distance. Because of the long years there were many wear and tear, but the boundless aura still remained. Over the years, it gradually became a famous scenery in the city. When outsiders came to the Immortal City to play, most of them would come down here to admire it. But other than that, the legends about the relic had been passed down for many years. There were all kinds of sayings. For example, there were ancient demons under the Immortal City, or treasures of heaven and earth in the depths of the relic, and so on. There were many kinds. However, it was generally accepted that the ruins were extremely dangerous and had caused the deaths of many people. For the sake of safety, several deity transformation stage perfected lords of the previous generation of the true Immortal Alliance cast a spell together to seal all the entrances to the ancient ruins. Since then, there were no more demons or ghosts in the Immortal City. Zhang Xianming did his best to manage this place, and also made the Immortal City develop with each passing day. Many years later, the Immortal City was divided into the Upper City and the Lower City. The so-called Upper City specifically referred to the Azure Dragon district where the Azure Dragon statue was located. This area was located halfway up the Sky Dragon Mountain, and the terrain was at least 100 meters higher than the other districts. It was different from the other districts and had been directly expropriated by Zhang Xianming long ago. Now, almost all the high-level people in Zhang Xianming lived here. In addition, the other three districts, namely White Tiger, Vermilion Bird, and Black Tortoise, were all on flat ground. They were inferior to the Azure Dragon district in terms of majesty, but far more prosperous and lively. For many years, hundreds of millions of creatures lived in this big city named Immortal, and spent every day full of hope and surprises. Before we enter the city, I have something to say to you. On the bank of Yingxing River, White Lotus pulled Lu Chen and said to him. Old Ma, who was beside her, also stopped. Lu Chen said, "What is it?" "It's not convenient to bring this dog in," White Lotus pointed at Atsu very calmly. "Recently, someone in the city is killing dogs." "Well?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "Old Ma told me about this before, but I don't think it's a big problem. After all, the damn Baldy's identity and status are extraordinary. It's not a big deal to protect a dog." "Woof." Atsu barked next to him, seeming to be a little happy. White Lotus shook her head and said, "It's not a good idea. It always causes trouble for Martial Uncle Tianlan. You can leave it outside the city. Anyway, when we were in Kunlun Mountain, Atsu also ran around all day. It shouldn't get lost." Lu Chen's face changed slightly and then he shook his head and said, "No." White Lotus was stunned and said in surprise, "What?" Chapter 386. Lu Chen looked at the Immortal City from afar, looking at the almost endless bustling scene of Mount Tianlong. Even though he was far away now, he seemed to be able to feel the hustle and bustle there. There are so many people here. It's hard to count the number of dogs or stray dogs without owners. I'm afraid it will be very difficult for the people under you to give the order to kill dogs, right? White Lotus shrugged and looked indifferent. She said, "Who cares? Anyway, I don't raise dogs. Besides, he is a perfected cultivator in the Huashan realm. He has high cultivation, high status and power. He can do whatever he wants. Why should he care about what your people do?" "Well, what you said is very reasonable." Lu Chen smiled, then turned back to Old Ma and said, "Since it's not good to take Atsu into the city, I won't go in. Go back and tell the damn Baldy to come out to see me, okay?" Old Ma was a little stunned for a moment and didn't know what to say. White Lotus, who was next to him, was also shocked. After a while, she frowned and said, "What nonsense are you talking about? Martial Uncle Tianlan is a person of high status. It's already a great honor for him to see you. How can he condescend to come out of the city to see you?" Lu Chen ignored her. He just looked at Old Ma and said, "Old Ma, you know what's going on. Does he want to see me or do I want to see him?" Old Ma gave a wry smile and said, "Well, it's him who wants to see you." White Lotus looked unhappy and said, "Even if Martial Uncle Tianlan wants to see you, isn't it a matter of course for you to pay a visit to him given his status?" Lu Chen smiled and reached out to touch Atsu, who was standing next to him. He said, "This time I don't want to follow this matter of course. Go back and tell the damn Baldy that I'll wait here tonight. If I don't come tonight, I'll leave tomorrow." "How dare you?" Before Old Ma could answer, White Lotus had already shouted at him. But then the beautiful girl suddenly rolled her eyes and the original anger suddenly disappeared. She looked at Lu Chen with some suspicion and said, "Who are you? Why are you so fearless in the face of a perfected cultivator in the Huashan realm? Aren't you afraid that the perfected cultivator will be furious and turn you into powder in an instant?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes, I'm very scared." After saying that, he turned around and walked towards a small forest not far away. Black Dog Atu was about to follow when it suddenly turned around and glared fiercely at Old Ma and White Lotus. It let out a low growl and bared its fangs as it shook its head threateningly. Then it swung its tail and trotted after Lu Chen. White Lotus was furious and was about to scold him, but she suddenly heard Old Ma cry out, "Hey, Atsu, why are you being so fierce to me? It's not like I'm the one who's unhappy with you." White Lotus's words were about to come out of her mouth, but she was choked back by this guy's words. She turned around and glared at old Ma, saying, "How can you say that? This person is disrespectful to the perfected cultivator. Is it wrong for us to scold him?" "That's right." Old Ma immediately replied seriously, then turned around and walked toward the immortal city. At the same time he said, "Let's go back and pay our respects to the perfected cultivator and ask him to make a decision. It would be best if he could kill this guy in his anger and vent my anger." White Lotus followed him and looked at old Ma suspiciously. She said, "Really? But you seem to be very familiar with this Luchin?" Old Ma sneered and shook his head repeatedly. He said, "Miss, you've misunderstood me. This guy has been an eyesore to me for more than 10 years. If I'm lucky enough to meet the perfected cultivator later, you'll see what I say to him." Oh. White Lotus couldn't figure out the relationship between the two men for a while, so she stopped talking and followed old Ma to the immortal city. She occasionally looked back. Luchin, who was a little mysterious in her heart, seemed to have become more and more vague now. He was like a vague and indistinguishable shadow in the night. Zhengxianming was the most powerful cultivation organization among the human clan in the vast land of the Divine Land. In terms of strength alone, it had long surpassed any single cultivation sect in the past. It could even be said that in the history of the human clan, there had never been something like Zhengxianming. But its strength, at least for now, was an unquestionable fact. Zhengxianming controlled the immortal city, which was second to none in the world. The 6 perfected cultivators and the immortal allies were the supreme leaders of this powerful organization, Zhengxianming, so they naturally occupied the best things in this city. The Azure Dragon district on the Sky Dragon Mountain was undoubtedly the best place in the immortal city of the 4 major districts marked by the statues of the 4 sacred beasts in the mysterious ruins left behind in the ancient times. The Azure Dragon district on the Sky Dragon Mountain was undoubtedly the best place in the immortal city of the 4 districts marked by the statues of the 4 sacred beasts in the mysterious ruins left behind in the ancient times. The headquarters of Zhengxianming was located here. The entire Azure Dragon district was the territory of Zhengxianming, and the 6 perfected cultivators had also taken the best pieces of land here as their residences. Perfected Tianlan once returned to his own sect, the Kunlun Party, a few years ago. Many things happened on the way home and there were many different opinions, but the final result was still in front of everyone. Whether they accepted it or not, it was the same. After that, Perfected Tianlan stayed on the Kunlun Mountain for more than a year. Although there were many rumors in the outside world that he wanted to settle the hearts of the people in the Kunlun Party and eliminate the dissidents, he did not neglect the affairs of Zhengxianming, and there were no problems with remote control. After this period of time, Perfected Tianlan once again set out on his journey to the immortal city. However, this time, under the surface of calmness, there were many undercurrents surging in Zhengxianming. This was because from that time on, many disciples of the Kunlun Party joined Zhengxianming under various names and began to work for Perfected Tianlan. The Kunlun Party was one of the 5 famous sects in the world, and there were many outstanding talents in the sect. Therefore, gradually, the strength of Perfected Tianlan's sect suddenly increased, and its momentum also became more and more prosperous. Old Ma and White Lotus met Perfected Tianlan at noon that day. The super fatty, who was much fatter than Old Ma and of course much more burly, sat in his cave residence, passing shadow, and listened to what they had to say about Lu Chen. Perfected Tianlan's expression was like an ancient well, without any changes. When he turned to look down he saw 2 people standing there. White Lotus frowned slightly and there seemed to be a little anger on her face, while Old Ma looked down, like an old monk in meditation, as if nothing had anything to do with him. Perfected Tianlan shook his head, turned to White Lotus and smiled. He said gently, "You've worked hard on this journey, go and rest. I'll deal with the rest so you don't have to worry about it." White Lotus took a step forward and said, "Martial uncle, I think this person named Lu Chen is very strange. What's his background? How dare he be so arrogant and disrespectful to you?" Perfected Tianlan snorted and said, "This guy is rebellious and bold, so I must punish him severely. Alright, you can go now." White Lotus wanted to say something but stopped on second thought, and there seemed to be a trace of confusion in her eyes. But in the end she bowed and left the cave residence. At this time, there were only Perfected Tianlan and Old Ma left in the cave residence. They looked at each other and Perfected Tianlan suddenly said, "What did that brat say?" Old Ma coughed and said, "Lu Chen asked me to send his regards to you, and he said that it's not that he doesn't want to go up the mountain but, **T. Perfected Tianlan suddenly interrupted Old Ma impatiently and said, That brat is used to being arrogant and detestable. He even dares to scold me in front of me, so how could he be so polite behind my back? Tell me the truth, what he said. Old Ma gave a hollow laugh and secretly looked at Perfected Tianlan's expression. Not daring to hide it anymore, he could only say, "Well, Your Excellency, Lu Qin is still young." Before he finished his words, he saw Perfected Tianlan's expression change again. Old Ma's heart skipped a beat, and he did not dare to argue anymore. He hurriedly said, "Go back and tell the damn baldy that I'll wait here for a night, and if I don't come tonight, I'll leave tomorrow." After saying that, Old Ma only felt a chill on his back. He could not help but subconsciously look at Perfected Tianlan's shiny skull in front of him, and cold sweat appeared on his forehead. There was silence in the cave residence. Old Ma did not dare to look at Perfected Tianlan's expression, and he even subconsciously held his breath. After a while, Perfected Tianlan suddenly snorted and said, "It does sound like what that brat said. He's simply reckless, audacious and rebellious." After saying those words in a serious tone that made Old Ma's expression change, Perfected Tianlan stood up and walked out of the cave residence. At the same time, he calmed down and said to Old Ma, "Let's go and see that good-for-nothing guy." Old Ma said, "What?" Chapter 387. The small forest where Lu Qin and Atsu stayed was actually some distance away from the Immortal City, and it was also far away from the busy official roads. It was a very secluded place. When night fell, the huge city in the distance was brightly lit, while the forest here was dark and gloomy, as if they were two different worlds. Lu Qin sat quietly in the forest, his figure almost integrated with the surrounding darkness, looking like a vague shadow in the night, indistinct and difficult to distinguish. Atsu lay quietly beside him, a pair of dark green eyes shimmering in the darkness. Occasionally, it would look up at the sky as if there was something it was interested in the boundless sky. The night was quiet, and there was no other sound except the sound of the night wind blowing through the treetops. But the city in the distance was too big and too prosperous. Even at such a distance, Lu Qin could still feel the invisible aura emitted from that place. That was the place that all the cultivators in the world yearned for. At this time, suddenly footsteps came from outside the forest, and then, a fat and burly figure appeared in their sight. The person who came was Supreme Tianlan. However, with Supreme Tianlan's cultivation realm, if he really wanted to hide from their eyes and ears, he would naturally have countless means and divine sense to get close without being noticed. But this damn baldy didn't seem to want to do so, and he walked directly over. Perhaps he even increased his pace to remind Lu Qin of the fact that he had come here. Lu Qin stood up and looked behind Supreme Tianlan, who was slowly walking over, but found that there was no one behind Supreme Tianlan. He was startled and slightly frowned. Tianlan walked to Lu Qin, his face calm and his eyes deep, but in the end, a trace of complex light flashed across. After a moment he smiled and said, "Long time no see." Lu Qin sighed and his mood was a little complicated. The person in front of him had always been entangled with his fate in the first half of his life. He was indebted to him, but it seemed that he had betrayed his former friendship. He fled to the chaotic land and finally fell into the southern wilderness. In fact, it was not a short time but not too long either. From the beginning to the end it was only a few years. But at this moment, under the night sky beside the bustling city, when he saw this person again, Lu Qin still felt a sense of vicissitudes in his heart. "Long time, no see." Lu Qin also nodded. Tianlan looked at Lu Qin up and down, then glanced at Atu beside him. The black dog that was unusually large and looked like a giant wolf demonic beast 100 times larger than an ordinary dog. Tianlan's gaze suddenly paused for a moment, as if he was slightly surprised. He looked at it a few more times but then he turned away and looked at Lu Qin again. "Where's old Ma?" Qin asked. "Oh, he's waiting outside the woods," Tianlan said. "I think it's more casual for us to talk this time, just the two of us, so don't let him follow us in." Speaking of this, Tianlan smiled and said, "In the end, little Ma is just a messenger between the two of us. In the end we still have to say what we want to say, don't we? Or, could it be that you've been with him for so long that you actually trust him more than me?" Lu Qin's heart suddenly shrank, but his expression did not change. Without a moment of hesitation or pause, he shook his head and said, "Of course not." Tianlan chuckled and casually waved his wide robe sleeve. A gust of wind swept past, immediately blowing away the fallen leaves and dust in the woods, revealing a cleaner space. Then, this perfected lord of the divine transformation realm, who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, actually did not take it to heart. He casually sat down in front of Lu Qin and at the same time called out to Lu Qin, "Come, sit down and talk. It's so tiring to stand." This damn bald fatty would not feel tired even if he stood for a year. Lu Qin secretly criticized in his heart. Then he still sat down and said, "I heard from old Ma that it was you who wanted to see me?" "Yes." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and said, "That's right. I haven't heard from you for several years. I only know that you escaped into the depths of the land of chaos and finally fell into the Longchuan River. So when I heard that you suddenly came back, of course I wanted to see you." Lu Qin was silent for a moment. Then he looked up at Tianlan and said, "All these years you always thought that I was dead, right?" Tianlan shook his head and said, "No, I always believed that you were still alive." Lu Qin smiled and said, "You actually have so much confidence in me. It's hard for an ordinary person to come back alive after falling into the river." Tianlan said lightly, "You're someone that I personally taught. How can you be an ordinary person?" Lu Qin was stunned and did not say anything. Tianlan continued, "Moreover, if I didn't believe that you were still alive, do you think I would allow He to live well just because I forced you to die?" Lu Qin was slightly surprised and said, "He?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "Hunting you down is a great achievement. You can't possibly think that he would hide it from you, right? He told me everything from the beginning to the end. He even wanted to take me as his master and inherit my Taoism." Lu Qin's expression became somewhat complicated. At that moment he did not seem to know what to say. Finally, he smiled bitterly and said, "Then what did you do with him in the end?" Perfected Lord Tianlan said calmly, "I told him that he did a good job but it was still not enough for him to inherit my Taoism. I told him to cultivate more diligently. At the same time, I also transferred him from Kunlun Mountain to Zhengxianming to work for me. Now he can be considered as one of my generals." Lu Qin sighed and said, "Good move." Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted and said, "What move? It sounds like you're a little disdainful about it. Let's not talk about anything else." He didn't have any complaints at all and treated me like a talent scout. In order to strive for the top, his diligence and vigor are much stronger than yours. Lu Qin shook his head and said, "I know, I also had that vigor before. But it was almost worn away when I was in the devil cult more than 10 years ago." A trace of anger suddenly flashed across Perfected Lord Tianlan's face. He stared at Lu Qin and the darkness around his fat body seemed to suddenly surge, like a demon beast suddenly roaring in the dark void. But very soon Tianlan seemed to think of something again. His gaze on Lu Qin gradually softened. After a while he sighed softly. "Do you still blame me?" Tianlan asked Lu Qin. "No." Lu Qin shook his head and said, "In the first few years when I was burned to death by the black fire, I was indeed a little dissatisfied with you. But later I gradually got over it. If you hadn't saved me back then I wouldn't be where I am now. So, just take it as me repaying your kindness." Tianlan stared at him and said, "You've really gotten over it? If there's anything in your heart that you're unhappy about, you might as well tell me." Lu Qin said, "I've gotten over it. Anyway, those things are in the past. But..." He paused and looked up at Tianlan saying, "This time I do have a few things to ask you." "Go ahead." Lu Qin paused and said, "Su Qingjun, and how is the Su family in Kunwa City now?" Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him indifferently. After a while he suddenly smiled. His smile was gentle but there was a hint of coldness in his eyes. Chapter 388. There was a moment of silence in the forest. Lu Qin raised his head slightly and looked at Tianlan. After a while Tianlan said, "Didn't you ask little Ma about this before you came?" Lu Qin said, "I did, but old Ma didn't tell me much. He only said a few words and didn't want to say more. I think he was afraid that I would find out something and get angry. Maybe he wouldn't come to a mortal city and would run to Kunlun Mountain out of anger." Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a while, then he laughed and said, "It's funny, but thinking about little Ma, it might really be possible." Lu Qin smiled and said, "That's why I thought I'd come and ask you myself." Tianlan nodded and said, "Su Qingjun is a good girl. Back then that incident caused a storm in the city. There were people in the Su family and Kunlun sect who blamed and criticized her. She didn't defend herself and just took it. In the past few years she only focused on cultivation and made great progress. If there are no accidents, it shouldn't be a problem for her to easily reach the Yuanying realm." Lu Qin was silent for a while and then said, "It seems that she is not far from the truth to be able to get such a comment from you, a perfected lord of soul formation." Tianlan smiled and didn't say anything. His expression was calm as if what he said just now was a matter of course and had unshakable confidence. From what you said just now, the Su family seems to have a big reaction? Lu Chen asked again. Of course. Tianlan snorted and said, back then you went crazy and directly rushed into their mansion and killed Sumo in front of so many people. How do you think the Su family will react? Lu Chen said expressionlessly, I didn't kill wrongly and I don't regret it. Perfected Lord Tianlan waved his hand casually and said after a while, yes, you're right. The Su family was so angry that they wanted to get to the bottom of this. After you escaped, the Su family was not willing to let you go. They went back to the faction to investigate you. Not only did they want to investigate your background, but they also wanted to find out how you entered the Kunlun party. They wanted to get to the bottom of it. They probably wanted to find your relatives and family by following the vines. Hearing this, Lu Chen's expression became strange. Even though he never liked the Su family, the only exception was probably Su Qingjun. However, upon hearing Perfected Lord Tianlan's words, Lu Chen still had an indescribable sense of absurdity. How did he join the Kunlun party? It was arranged by Perfected Lord Tianlan. What background does he have? Does he have a backer? Of course, the most powerful deity in the Kunlun sect was his backer. In the eyes of those who knew the inside story, the Su family's aggressive investigation was really a bit suicidal. Then how did you stop them from investigating? Lu Chen asked, was it troublesome? Tianlan snorted and said, of course it was troublesome. You're the only one who knows how to make trouble. But it's just like that. I just made some arrangements so that they couldn't investigate further. Then what did you do to the Su family? Lu Chen looked at Tianlan with an inquiring look in his eyes. Tianlan said, I didn't do anything to them. I've been reorganizing the faction these years and didn't want to get involved. But old Ma told me about the grievances you suffered in the Su family. I just wanted to wait for you to come back and see what you think. Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, is it important what I think? How you deal with the Su family depends on me. Perfected Lord Tianlan said calmly, well, it's up to you. No matter what, you're mine. Since you suffered in their hands, it's only right for me to take revenge. The corner of Lu Chen's mouth twitched and he lowered his head slightly. After a moment he said calmly, forget it. The only one in the Su family who really hated me was Sumo and he was killed by me. The others didn't have much to do with me, but Su Qingjun had a good relationship with me in that year. Let's stop this matter. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes flickered and he said, let's stop here? Lu Chen nodded and said, yes, let's stop here. Don't get others involved. Okay. You said you had a few things to ask me. What about the other things? Tianlan asked. Lu Chen didn't know why, but when he looked at this fat and burly man, his original mood suddenly became a little bleak. He couldn't lift his spirits and felt more helpless. He was silent for a long time and then said with a wry smile, forget it. I suddenly don't want to talk about other things. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him and didn't get angry at Lu Chen's words. It seemed that this high-ranking Perfected Lord of Huashan Realm did have a whole new level of respect for the young man in front of him. He even seemed to know Lu Chen very well and was particularly tolerant of Lu Chen. He even said a few more words to Lu Chen, by the way, I also know about EXN. Lu Chen's body trembled slightly and he looked up. Tianlan said, the girl's body was taken back by her family and given a proper burial. I also asked the Kunlun sect to put in some effort to arrange a grand funeral for her. Let's just take it as us making it up to her a little. Lu Chen took a deep breath and then slowly stood up and said, when EXN was alive she didn't seem to like this kind of thing very much. But I know her intention and I think EXIN's parents can also feel it. I thank you on behalf of that unfortunate girl. After saying that, he straightened his expression and solemnly bowed to Perfected Lord Tianlan and then said, if EXN knows in the underworld, she will definitely want me to thank you on her behalf. Perfected Lord Tianlan calmly accepted the bow. When Lu Chen straightened up again he said, whether you still want to ask or not, since I'm here tonight, I naturally want to have a good talk with you. If you've said everything you want to know and know everything you want to know, then it's my turn to say it now, right? Lu Chen nodded and said, go ahead. Perfected Lord Tianlan said, come back and help me. Lu Chen paused for a moment and then said with a wry smile, with your power and strength, what kind of talent can't you find? Why do you insist on me coming back? Perfected Lord Tianlan said lightly, there are many people who want to help me, but I can't think of anyone else who is worthy of my complete trust and can be entrusted with such important matters by me. Lu Chen coughed and said, I've been listening to this kind of flattery for 10 years. I've long known that it's just a big empty pie in the sky. Don't lie to me. Perfected Lord Tianlan said with a smile, I'm not lying to you. I'm telling the truth. Lu Qin shook his head and said, I heard from old Ma that you've recently transferred many young experts from the Kunlun party over, and half of them have joined Fiyunji. These people are of the same lineage as you, so you can trust them in everything they do. Tianlan said, those people are passable, but I still can't trust them completely. And this time, there's one thing I still only trust in you. Lu Qin fell silent. After a while, a bitter expression appeared on his face and he said, the devil cult again? Yes, Tianlan said, it's the devil cult again. It has to be you. Bullsh*T. Lu Qin scolded, last time in Kunlun Mountain, you also said the same thing to me. In the end, there were only a few people from the devil cult on Kunlun Mountain. Instead, it was your 2 perfected lords and several major factions that were fighting among themselves. I'm not going to join in the fun. Chapter 389. Perfected Lord Tianlan paused for a moment and suddenly looked a little embarrassed, but he soon recovered and said to Lu Qin with a smile, that was an accident. You know what an accident means, right? Originally, I asked you to go there to track down the spy in the Kunlun party, but then an opportunity suddenly appeared for me to reorganize the Kunlun party. Do you think I should do it or not? Lu Qin sneered and said, after saying so much, where is the spy of the devil cult? Have you found him or not? Not yet. Perfected Lord Tianlan answered honestly, indeed I haven't found him yet. Actually, if you didn't cause so much trouble, such as directly rushing to the Su family to kill people, I still want you to continue to go back to Kunlun Mountain to help me find him. TSK. This time, Lu Qin didn't even bother to say anything and directly rolled his eyes at him. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed and said, let's forget about these things. It's all in the past after all. What's your plan now? The corner of Lu Qin's eye twitched and he said, just don't bother me. I'll find a place to eat and wait for my death. It's very comfortable. Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head and said, that's too much of a pity. Others can't learn your skills at all. Lu Qin sneered and said, what's there to pity? This deadly skill, whoever wants it can take it. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed and looked at Lu Qin very gently, like a father looking at a naughty child. After a while he said, don't be anxious, listen to me. Lu Qin shrugged and sat down on the ground indifferently. Although his expression was as usual, it was not that he didn't have those complicated emotions in his heart. In fact, sometimes, even he himself did not quite understand how he felt when facing this damned baldy who had raised him since he was young and taught him all of his skills. Respect, worship, resentment, anger, trust, or doubt. There seemed to be something in every kind of feeling. When he followed old Ma to the immortal city from Qingshitang village this time, before he really saw Tianlan, Lu Qin was actually a little nervous and perturbed. Because until today he still couldn't see and understand this damn baldy clearly. Is he good or bad? Did he really believe her or was he just using her with his flowery words? Lu Qin felt that these matters were shrouded in clouds and mist, and he couldn't see through them clearly. I really believe you. Perfected Lord Tianlan's calm voice came from the darkness ahead. There was no fluctuation of emotion, as if what he said was the most natural thing in the world. You know, in the past few decades, I founded the Fuyun Agency and gathered many talents to do the most important thing, which is to deal with the devil cult. But the demons of the devil cult are too cunning. After they can't beat us, they hide in the dark and play all kinds of tricks. Even now, a lot of them have infiltrated into Zhangxianming. It's very troublesome. Lu Qin was silent for a moment and said, I heard from old Ma that even your subordinates in Fiyunji have caught a few devil cult spies. Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered and said, isn't that so? Even the organization I specially set up to deal with the devil cult has been infiltrated by the demons of the devil cult. That's why I said that the idiots of Zhangxianming have cultivated too much that even their brains have been damaged. Nowadays, the devil cult only looks weak on the surface, but it is everywhere in the dark and has far-reaching influence. Maybe its real strength is far beyond our imagination. If we don't attack it, I'm afraid a big disaster is right in front of us. Lu Qin was silent. Tianlan glanced at him and said, I've said something similar to you before. Today, I might as well say it to you again. In dealing with the devil cult, I really only trust you. Because everyone in the world may be a spy of the devil cult, but only you are not. Come back and help me. Tianlan said slowly, word by word. Lu Qin sat in the dark, quiet and silent. At this time it was already late at night and there was almost no light in the woods. Their figures had long been integrated into the surrounding darkness. He couldn't see Tianlan clearly and didn't know if Tianlan could really see him clearly. I still don't really want to do it. After a long time, Lu Qin broke the silence and said, I always have a feeling that I've been doing the same thing all my life, and it seems that this thing can never be finished. I'm a little annoyed. Tianlan nodded slightly in the dark. After a while he said, Then what do you want to do? Lu Qin said, I've said it before. Find a place to eat and wait for death. Well, I've worked hard for you for more than 10 years. In exchange for the rest of my life it's not too much, right? Tianlan seemed to be amused by his words. He chuckled and then sighed saying, It's not too much, not too much. For some reason the more they talked face to face like this, the calmer Lu Qin felt. Although he had not completely abandoned the suspicion he once had, it had gradually weakened a lot. This person he had watched grow up, the person he once saw as a father, this tall and burly figure, perhaps his position in his heart was even greater and more deep-rooted than he had imagined. Of course you can choose to hide and eat and wait for death. I won't force you nor will I break my promise. Lord Tianlan said lightly in the dark, but I think you should also know that some things can't be done as you like. You're still young and your cultivation and talent are not bad. In the future you'll probably live longer than me. But once I die or when the devil cult strength suddenly rises again, as long as they seize the place of Fiyunji, they can find a lot of things. At that time, it won't be difficult to find your hiding place. Lu Qin snorted coldly but didn't say anything. Tianlan looked at him and said, As long as the devil cult is not destroyed, even if you hide, you won't feel at ease. I'm telling the truth. Destroy, 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 you only know how to destroy the devil cult. Lu Qin suddenly became a little angry and said to Tianlan with a trace of anger, It's been more than 10 or 20 years and you still say the same thing. But how to destroy it? During the Battle of the Barren Valley we've done so much, but the devil cult still hasn't been destroyed. After so many years it's still like a ghost. You also said that there's a secret in Kunlun Mountain, but we've searched around and still found nothing. Then tell me, what should I do to completely get rid of this disgusting and ferocious devil cult? Tianlan was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he smiled and said in a gentle voice, Why, it seems that you're very annoyed by this matter? Nonsense, I've been pestered by this matter for more than 10 or 20 years, and I've been worried about dying a violent death every day. Who wouldn't be annoyed? Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and said, You're right. Actually, I've thought about all of these before. Recently, I've suddenly realized something. We definitely have to destroy the devil cult. However, the direction that we've been taking in the past might not be right. Lu Qin glanced at him and said, What do you mean? Perfected Lord Tianlan said, Previously we always wanted to get rid of those important figures in the devil cult, thinking that we can destroy the devil cult by killing all of these ambitious demons. But the truth shows that this method is not effective. The demons of the devil cult are always like weeds popping up in waves. But later I suddenly thought of a key point that might be able to destroy the devil cult once and for all. Lu Qin's body trembled slightly. He looked up at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said after a while, Is there really such a way? Yes. What is it? Tianlan smiled in the darkness. The darkness shrouded him, making his tall figure look like a devil in the darkness, terrifying and terrifying. The divine tree. After saying that, Perfected Lord Tianlan became indifferent again and said, That thing has been the source of the devil cult's belief for thousands of years. As long as we find a way to destroy it, the devil cult will naturally collapse, right? Lu Qin suddenly fell into silence and did not say a word for a long time. Chapter 390. What do you think? Tianlan asked, probably seeing that Lu Qin did not speak for a long time. Lu Qin was silent for a moment and said, I thought the tree of God of the devil cult is the same as the gods in other myths and legends. They are all illusory things that do not exist in the world. Tianlan smiled and said, In the legends of the devil cult, the real tree of God is a divine object that has existed since the beginning of the world. Not only is it indomitable, but it can also cross the heavens and the earth and give birth to all things. It is the origin of all living things in the world. You should have heard of these myths in the devil cult, right? Lu Qin nodded and said, Yes, this is the fundamental belief of the devil cult demons. Of course I know about it. However, in the devil cult, there is always a part that cannot be justified. That is, from the beginning to the end, from the birth of the devil cult until now, no one has really seen the appearance of the tree of God in this world. There are only extravagant myths that can only deceive those who have no brains. A glimmer of light flashed across Tianlan's eyes. He looked at Lu Qin and asked with a smile, You don't believe it? Lu Chen said, I don't believe it. Lord Tianlan nodded and seemed to be quite satisfied with Lu Chen's attitude. He then said, this thing is naturally insignificant to us, but for the demons of the devil cult, it is a very important matter. In addition, I heard that in the devil cult there is the so-called branch, leaf, seed. Do you know about it? Lu Chen's heart suddenly jumped, but he looked as usual. After thinking for a moment, he said, it is probably the one branch, two leaves, one seed that they say? The people of the devil cult said that these four treasures are the remains of the tree of God left in this world. At the same time, there is another saying that as long as these four divine objects are gathered and the secret method passed down from the devil cult era is used to perform the summoning ceremony, the door of void realm can be opened and the tree of God will be summoned back to this world. Ridiculous. Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered with a disdainful look on his face and said, this statement sounds very far-fetched. Even if it's true, those idiots in the devil cult don't think about it. How can something that can break the void and enter this world through summoning be a deity that can bring them eternal life and power? I think it's more likely to be a catastrophe. Lu Chen smiled and did not say anything, but judging from his expression, he obviously had no objection to Lord Tianlan's words. After sneering, Lord Tianlan asked Lu Chen, by the way, have you seen these four objects before? Lu Chen sat upright on the ground, like a shadow blending into the surrounding darkness. His face could not be seen clearly. After a while, he said calmly, I have never seen these four divine objects in the evil faction. Back then, I also asked Yin Shouyang about this, and he said that this myth and legend has been passed down for thousands of years, until now it is difficult to distinguish the truth from the lies. However, these four treasures do exist, but it seems that not all of them are in the hands of the evil faction demons. A few of them have already been lost in the world, until now there is no hope of finding them. Yes. Lord Tianlan nodded and said, what you said is similar to what I know. It is basically like this. Lu Chen raised his head slightly and looked at him. He said, then what do you plan to do now? And what do you mean by destroying the tree of God? Lord Tianlan said, actually, after I thought of this, I have already secretly made some arrangements. Of course it is still early. Roughly speaking, we'll first find one or a few of the four divine objects, branch, leaf and seed, and then we'll use these to find the others. Lu Chen suddenly raised his voice as if he was a little surprised. He interrupted and asked, if you find one divine object, you can find other divine objects through it? Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and touched his bald head with his hand. Then he said, I do have some ideas. We can give it a try. You know, when one's cultivation realm reaches my level, he will always think of or understand some strange divine powers. It just so happens that I have a divine power that can divine the whereabouts of other things through the same species. Of course, this divine power is actually not so effective every time, especially for these things that are related to the legendary divine objects. The mysteries of heaven are even more mysterious and it is easy to make a mistake. But it is still a method after all. Lu Chen paused for a moment and said, that's amazing. How confident are you? Lord Tianlan laughed and said, about 70% to 80%. Lu Chen's pupils suddenly constricted. Fortunately, he could not see clearly in the darkness. After a while, he said in a low voice, this should be very confident. Lord Tianlan smiled and said, that is why I want you to come and help me to see if you can find those branches, leaves and seeds. Just as Lu Chen was about to speak, Perfected Lord Tianlan waved his hand slightly and stopped him. I roughly know what you want to say. However, I still think that you're the most suitable person for this matter. After all, it's something that's closely related to the devil cult. No one is more familiar with the devil cult than you. How about helping me one more time? He stared at Lu Chen and said, let's completely eliminate this evil scourge that has been harming the world for thousands of years, okay? Lu Chen took a deep breath and just when he was about to speak, he suddenly hesitated. He felt waves of coldness appear on his forehead and back, and he suddenly realized to his shock that he was actually drenched in sweat unknowingly, and his forehead was covered in cold sweat. After a while, Lu Chen suddenly nodded heavily and said in a deep voice, okay, I will help you with this. I was right about you. Perfected Lord Tianlan walked to Lu Chen's side with a gratified expression and patted the latter's shoulder gently. I knew that you wouldn't disappoint me. Perfected Lord Tianlan said in a joyful tone. Lu Chen snorted and said, you won't make me work for nothing again this time, right? Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment and said, when did I make you work for nothing? I don't think so. That time on the Kunlun mountain, Lu Chen said indifferently, you called me over and made a bunch of extravagant promises, but you have not fulfilled any of them until now. A trace of embarrassment flashed across Lord Tianlan's old face. Then he smiled bitterly and said, I'm indeed in the wrong for this matter. I'm sorry, but you should also understand that there are things that I can't do either. Back then on the night of the full moon, you suddenly rushed to the Su family at the foot of the mountain and killed them. Then, you immediately escaped and attracted the attention of both the Orthodox and the demon sections. Under such circumstances, I was the new sect leader and needed to reorganize the major forces in the Kunlun party. I really couldn't stand up for you. Lu Qin waved his hand and said, I know. That's why I came back to see you this time. I'll help you with this matter again, but I also want to know how you'll arrange things for me if this matter is done well. At least, I'll have something to worry about. Lord Tianlan stared at Lu Qin for a long time and suddenly nodded. You're right. Actually, even if things don't go well for you this time, it's just bad luck and I won't blame you. What I want to tell you is that no matter what, I'll fulfill my promise after this matter is over. As he said that, he suddenly reached out and grabbed one of Lu Qin's palms before stuffing something into his palm. Based on the feeling of the skin on his palm, Lu Qin instinctively felt that it seemed to be a square metal plate. It was hard and a little cold and its edges were smooth and round. However, the center of the plate was uneven and seemed to be engraved with a word. He rubbed it for a moment and suddenly frowned. Looking at Lord Tianlan, he asked in surprise, What's this? The word Tan? One day you'll inherit this Taoist name from me. Right now, perfected Lord Tianlan's unusually tall and burly body seemed like a tall mountain in the darkness. Even his voice seemed to carry a trace of an ancient aura. Lu Qin, keep it well. This is something that I should have given to you more than 10 years ago. Chapter 391. Something that should have been given more than 10 years ago? What was the meaning of this so-called heavenly token? Everything seemed to be possible to guess, but perfected Lord Tianlan did not continue to explain to Lu Qin, and Lu Qin did not ask further. He just slowly clenched the token in his hand and did not say a word in the darkness. No one could see the expression on his face at the moment, so no one could guess his current mood. The night wind swept past the treetops, making rustling sounds and adding a bit of silence to the world. No one else knew the content of this conversation in the forest in the middle of the night, including old Ma, who had been staying outside the small forest from the beginning to the end. He was a bit bored, but in fact he was also a bit worried. He would look at the forest from time to time, but he never had the intention to go in. Until he saw Atsu walking out of the darkness in the forest in the night, and then Lu Qin's figure also appeared in his sight. Old Ma immediately went to greet them. When he was about to say something, he suddenly turned his head and looked to the side. Then, with a slightly surprised expression, he asked Lu Qin, Where is perfected Lord Tianlan? He went back first. Lu Qin said, He said that he has something to deal with and has to rush back, so he won't come to see you again. He asked me to tell you on his behalf. Old Ma nodded. He naturally did not dare to be dissatisfied with perfected Lord Tianlan. He said, His Excellency is very busy every day, so of course he is very busy. It doesn't matter. By the way, how did your conversation go? Lu Qin was silent for a moment and said, It went well, but he asked me to stay here in Immortal City to help him. Old Ma immediately looked happy. He patted Lu Qin's shoulder and said with a smile, That's good. Immortal City is the most prosperous place in the world, and you have a perfected Lord of Soul Formation as your backer. If you stay here and work, your life will be too easy. He still wants me to help him deal with the devil cult, Lu Qin said. Old Ma paused for a moment, his brows slightly wrinkled. After a moment he slowed down his speech as if he was thinking, said, If that is the case, then it is hard to say. After all, the evil faction side is full of lunatics. But, this seems to be what you have been doing all your life. At least you are much better than others. Lu Qin smiled bitterly and looked at Old Ma helplessly. You also know that this is the only thing I've done in my life? Old Ma shrugged and then he said, Have you thought it through? Let me know if you've made a decision. I'll return to the Immortal City to see the Lord first, and then I'll arrange everything. Lu Qin opened his mouth to say something, but he suddenly held back. He placed his hand on his chest and pressed lightly. After a moment of silence, he said in a low voice, All right, then go and ask them what they want us to do. All right. When the morning sun shone down from the horizon, Lu Qin was still lying on the ground in the forest, his head resting on the soft fur of Atsu. As the sun gradually rose, the light and shadow in the forest kept changing, shifting. There was a kind of strange and breathtaking beauty. Lu Qin woke up in the morning light but did not get up. He only looked at the light and shadow crisscrossing, changing strange scene. Occasionally he would reach out and touch his chest. Under his clothes, there was already a tag hanging on his chest, and there was still a trace of faintly discernible cool air coming from it. He waited until noon before he saw old Ma return, looking at his hurried footsteps, but his expression was considered normal. Lucian then slowly sat up, smiled at old Ma and said, "You've worked hard, how's the matter?" Old Ma sat down in front of him and did not talk nonsense with Lucian. He said straightforwardly, "We don't need to fight and kill this time. The most important task is to find the evil sect's legendary branch, leaf and seed." Lucian nodded his head and said, "How do we find it? At least when I was in the evil sect I didn't really see these divine objects. Now we have to rely on the two of us to look for it blindly?" After a pause, Lucian said, "If that's really the case, I think the two of us should go back to Qingshitang village, at least it might be a little safer there." Old Ma laughed and said, "Don't worry, although it's very difficult to find these things, Perfected Immortal has already told me that the most important thing about these divine objects of the same origin is that they are intertwined with each other's fate energy. As long as one of them is found, someone will use other secret techniques to deduce the approximate location of the other divine objects." Lucian raised his eyebrows and said, "There's actually such a powerful supernatural power? Who knows?" Old Ma smiled and said, "Anyway, it's all the supernatural power of perfected immortals. It's not strange that we mortals can't compare." Lucian pondered for a moment and said, "Even so, the world is so big, it's really too difficult to find the 4 treasures that have no clues at all." Before he finished speaking, Old Ma interrupted, "Don't be afraid, Perfected Immortal has already told me very clearly this morning. Now in this immortal city, including the land within 100 miles, there's a hidden divine object. We just need to think of a way to find it." Lucian's expression changed and instantly became a little serious. He looked at Old Ma and said, "Where did this news come from?" Old Ma shook his head and said, "I also heard it from Perfected Immortal. Of course I don't know the specific source of the news, and it's not convenient for me to ask." Old Ma was telling the truth. Lucian nodded slowly, but a trace of uneasiness flashed across his heart. No one knew better than him that at this moment, there was a seed of the sacred tree sealed in his body, and it was also very likely that this treasure was one of the 4 divine objects that he and Old Ma had mentioned before. He originally thought that as long as he strictly guarded against this secret would never be known by others. But now it seemed that there was someone else who might know this secret? Or was it just a pure coincidence? He lowered his head and pondered for a long time without saying a word, but Old Ma, who was standing at the side, came over and patted his shoulder and said with a smile, "Don't think too much. Anyway, in the end, isn't it just a battle of wits and courage with the demons of the devil cult? We've been doing this for so many years, what's there to be afraid of?" Lucian grunted and nodded. Old Ma smiled and said, "Since you also understand this, then let's go. Right now, let's go to the immortal city and find an inn to stay for a couple of days to rest. In the future, should we also make a disguise to avoid being discovered by others?" Lucian glanced at him and said, "What do you want to do?" Old Ma coughed and said, "How about the two of us cooperate to open a shop?" "Forget it." Lucian bluntly pointed at his heart and said, "When you do business, it's always a losing business. Every shop you open collapses, you've never made money and you've even subsidized it every time. If you go to open a shop in the immortal city, I'm afraid you'll be suppressed by others in 8 to 10 days. Old Ma grunted, but with an arrogant look on his face he said, "What do you know? We have a backer behind us. If we encounter any trouble, we can just look for the Lord to solve it. And what's more, it's actually just a kind of speculation. As for the actual situation, Lord Immortal also said that he might not be 100% sure." Lucian grunted again, feeling that there was no need for him to be entangled on this issue, so he deliberately changed the topic and said, "This time, was it also you and I who directly contacted the damn Baldy?" "That's not it." A burst of laughter as clear as a wind chime came from outside the forest. Chapter 392. Lucian and Old Ma looked at each other, then turned to look together. At noon, when the sun shone through the gaps between the branches and leaves, a slender and beautiful figure walked in from outside the forest. It was a beautiful and mature woman. She had a smile on her face, charming and gentle. She even waved at Lucian, then said with a smile, "Lord True Monarch, firstly, he has too many things to deal with every day. Most of the time he is really too busy. Secondly, he has too big of a target. Even though his Tao is profound and powerful, he really attracts too much attention. If it was somewhere else it would be fine. But in this immortal city with countless hidden dragons and crouching tigers, it is very easy to attract the attention of other forces. She smiled and said to Lu Chen and old Ma, "You guys don't want this to happen, do you?" Lu Chen stared at this woman, his brows slightly furrowed. After a moment he said in a deep voice, "Shuang? Hall Leader Shui?" "That's me." The woman nodded with a smile and said, "I am Shuang, the hall leader of the Fuyunji you guys were in before. You can say that I am temporarily helping Lord True Monarch to look after you." Lu Chen's expression became more serious. No matter who it was, as long as they were below the level of Divine Monarch, when facing this woman, whether they were friend or foe, almost all of them would involuntarily feel a kind of reverence mixed with complex emotions. Fuyunji was an organization founded by Lord Tianlan many years ago. It was affiliated with Zheng Xianmeng. Influenced by the founder, for many years, Fuyunji had always been one of the most fierce organizations in the righteous path against the devil sect. Every year both sides had to pay a high price for this kind of hatred. And Shuang had also become one of the few enemies of the devil sect who had a blood feud with Lord Tianlan. For the past few years the true immortal alliance had been growing stronger day by day, the evil sect had been weakening, and there was almost no stronger external enemy. The world had been peaceful for a long time, for a very long time. There had not been any overly intense and bloody battle. However, even under such circumstances, Shuang still became the hall master of the true immortal alliance whose hands were stained with the most blood and lives. It could be said that she was the most eye-catching. In recent years the devil cult had been on the wane. Although there were often news of devil cult followers in other parts of the Divine Land, but looking at the overall situation, the once powerful devil cult began to go downhill after the crucial battle of the Desolate Valley in the Land of Chaos more than 10 years ago. Lu Chen's original identity was actually a shadow in Fuyunji, but he was a rather special existence. After lurking in the devil sect for so many years, there was only one person in the outside world who could directly contact him, and that was Old Ma. And on the surface, Old Ma was just an ordinary member of Fuyunji, but in private he would directly report to Lord Tianlan about the matter of Lu Chen. And because of this, in the past, Lu Chen did not fawn over this beautiful hall leader like most of the Fuyunji shadows, and Shuang did not seem to understand them. But this situation seemed to have changed today. In the future, if you are in the Immortal City, you can temporarily be considered as one of my subordinates. If there is anything, I will help you ask Lord Tianlan. What do you think? Shuang said very politely, as if they were old friends for many years, discussing with Lu Chen and Old Ma. Lu Chen smiled, nodded and said, "Okay." Shuang laughed, clapped her hands and said, "Then it's settled. You and Old Ma can find a place to rest for the next 2 days, then I will arrange for you to find a business in the Immortal City as a cover. Things can be carried out slowly, there is no hurry." Speaking up to here, she paused, then smiled and said, "In addition, there is one more thing I want to tell you. Lord Tianlan has already discussed this matter in depth with me, and I know the whole thing from the beginning to the end. Because there are too many mountains in this immortal city, there are many eyes spying on us both in the open and in the dark, so it is indeed not very convenient for Lord Tianlan. So in the future the two of you better not look for him directly. If there is anything, tell me, okay?" Old Ma frowned slightly and turned to look at Lu Chen, only to find that the other was also looking at him. The two of them looked at each other in the air for a moment, then turned away. After a while, Old Ma laughed and cupped his hands to Shuang. "Hallmaster Shui is right. Then in the future we brothers will have to ask Hallmaster to take care of us. You are too polite." Shui Ying's attitude had always been very gentle and polite, but for some reason, there seemed to be an indistinct sense of distance between them. Moreover, when facing the two of them, she seemed to treat them differently. Intentionally or unintentionally, she placed more of her attention on the quiet Lu Chen. It was also at this time that Lu Chen opened his mouth and said to Shuang, "Hallmaster Shui, there is something that I need your help with." Shuang nodded and said, "Go ahead." Lu Chen pointed at Atsu lying on the side and said, "This dog has been with me for many years. Can it follow me into the city?" Shuang glanced at the huge figure of Atsu and was obviously startled. Her beautiful eyebrows furrowed and then said, "This might be a bit troublesome. Recently, in the city? You should know about the dog prohibition order, right?" As she spoke, she raised her head and looked at Lu Chen and Old Ma. Lu Chen and Old Ma both nodded. Lu Chen then said, "I know about that. Old Ma also told me before to let it loose in the mountains around the Immortal City for a period of time. However, this is the Immortal City, not an ordinary place. There are countless experts in the open and in the dark. I am not at ease." Shuang was obviously still a bit hesitant. After pondering for a moment she said, "This black dog is too big of a target. It is too eye-catching. If you keep it by your side and one day it runs out onto the street, I am afraid that in the blink of an eye, you will be in danger of being exposed." Lu Qin interrupted, "Then if we only stay in our residence and don't go out, is that okay?" Shuang thought for a moment and said, "That should be much better. However, the two of you used to be in this line of work. If there is a mistake, the two of you should know what the consequences will be, right?" Lu Qin smiled and did not say anything else. Instead, he lowered his body and stroked Atsu's head. Old Ma did not say a word. Shuang glanced at the two of them and did not say anything else. After chatting with them for a while about future arrangements, she said goodbye and left. However, before she left, she secretly gave Old Ma a look. Old Ma coughed and said to Lu Qin with a smile, "You sit here for a while, I will send Hallmaster Shui off." After saying that, he followed Shuang out of the forest. Once they were out of the forest, they immediately felt that their vision was much brighter and their mood was much more cheerful. However, there was not much joy or excitement on Shui Ying's face. At the edge of the forest, she turned to look at Old Ma. Old Ma laughed bitterly in embarrassment. Shui Ying coldly snorted and said, "Old Ma, you are also an old man in Fiyunji. I do not need to lecture you on whether this matter is right or wrong, do I?" Old Ma nodded repeatedly and said, "Hallmaster, please calm down. You are indeed in the wrong in this matter. What you said is reasonable." Shuang said, "Then why did he insist on bringing that dog along? Logically speaking, this person has been a shadow for more than 10 years. It is impossible for him not to know the rules here. Or is this Lu Qin taking advantage of the Lord True Monarch's high regard for him to purposely give me a hard time?" Old Ma immediately shook his head and said, "There is absolutely no such thing. Hallmaster, please do not overthink it." Shui Ying's expression fluctuated. She seemed to be a little cold, but she did not seem to be angry. After a while, she suddenly smiled and said, "Forget it. No matter what, we are all working for the Lord True Monarch. Let us keep in touch in the future." After saying that, she nodded to Old Ma and floated away. Old Ma looked at the graceful and beautiful figure and thought of the bloody legends that had tainted this woman in the past. He then looked back at the forest and could not help but smile bitterly and shake his head. He said in a low voice, "They are all troublesome." Chapter 393. "This is troublesome." Old Ma looked a little worried and said to Lu Qin, "This is a little troublesome." Lu Qin sat on the ground, one hand casually stroking Atsu's head. Atsu also rested its head on Lu Qin's thigh with a satisfied expression. Its two giant eyes were also half closed, and it occasionally grunted twice as if it was about to fall asleep. Hearing Old Ma's complaint, Lu Qin looked up at him and smiled, "What's wrong?" Old Ma squatted down beside him, glanced at the huge black dog and said, "You know what's going on, so I don't have to talk nonsense. We'd better keep a low profile when we enter the Immortal City, but if you insist on bringing Atsu, it's really troublesome." Roar. Suddenly there was a low roar and it was aggressive, as if a ferocious demon beast had suddenly jumped out of the forest, which startled Old Ma. But when he took a closer look, there was no movement around him. The one who roared was Atsu, who looked simple and silly just now. This giant dog, which was already taller than an adult man, stared at Old Ma with a fierce look in its eyes. It let out a low growl from its throat, but it looked like it was about to bite Old Ma. The snow-white fangs and the fierce look in Atsu's eyes made Old Ma's heart skip a beat, and he subconsciously took a step back. But at this moment, Lu Qin reached out from the side and with a smile he slapped Atsu's head and scolded with a smile, "Don't mess around, Old Ma is one of us." Atsu retracted the fangs that he had just bared just a moment ago. He glared at Old Ma and looked a little unwilling, but he still lay down next to Lu Qin while huffing and puffing. Old Ma heaved a sigh of relief and couldn't help cursing again, "Damn it! I gave you so many meat bones to eat back then, and now you've forgotten all about it." Lu Qin waved his hand and said to Old Ma, "This matter may be a little troublesome, but please take the trouble. The mountains around the Immortal City are not safe. I don't feel at ease leaving Atsu alone outside." Old Ma pondered for a moment and said to Lu Qin, "Actually, it's not difficult for us to bring Atsu into the city and find a bigger house to stay in. I'm just afraid that after a long time, Atsu will be so bored that they can't take it anymore and run out to the streets. That would be troublesome." Lu Qin thought for a moment and suddenly asked Old Ma, "This time, we won't have to pay for the expenses ourselves, right?" Old Ma immediately said, "Of course, no matter what, we are still working for Fiyunji. At least they have to pay for our daily expenses. Well, I still have to talk to hall leader Shui later to see if she can give me more money to open a shop, a storefront or something. This is our business without any capital. At the end of his speech, Old Ma rubbed his hands excitedly. It seemed that he still cared about doing business and opening a shop. Even if he had failed repeatedly on the road of business in the past 10 years and suffered countless losses, he still had a lot of money. As someone who had experienced that period of time with Old Ma, Lucian was very clear about Old Ma's experience and ability in this regard. But since it was not his own money, Lucian did not care about it. He just said to Old Ma seriously, "That's good. When you go to ask for money, ask for an extra, a large portion of rations for Atsu." Old Ma was startled and said, "A large portion of rations? What is this for?" Lucian touched the smooth fur on Atsu's back and patted its belly. He smiled and said, "This dog is different from ordinary dogs. Believe me, as long as there is enough delicious food, I guarantee that it will be too lazy to take a step out." Old Ma looked at Atsu with some astonishment. He could not help but roll his eyes and said, "Is there such a thing? I say, are you a dog or a pig?" 2 days later, an extremely spacious carriage that could seat 4 to 5 people silently stopped outside the forest. The coachman was a dark, skinny and capable-looking old man around 50 years of age. He didn't make a sound when he arrived and just parked the carriage without saying a word. Then he sat in the carriage and waited silently. After a while, Old Ma, Lucian, and Atsu walked out of the forest and got on the carriage. From the beginning to the end, the old coachman looked straight ahead and did not look at them. It seemed that he was completely unaware of what was happening behind him. It was not until the sound of Old Ma closing the carriage door was heard that he seemed to suddenly wake up. He also did not look back but picked up the whip in his hand. With a crack of the whip, the sound of horse hooves could be heard. The carriage turned around and began to walk towards the immortal city in the distance. The carriage was very spacious, and the inside was also clean and tidy. Once the door was closed, it was as if it was isolated from the outside world. There were small windows on both sides of the carriage, but at the same time, there was a curtain so that the people inside the carriage could see the scenery outside, but the people outside the carriage could not see the situation inside the carriage clearly. It was very convenient. After entering the carriage, perhaps because Lucian had already told them beforehand, Atsu obediently lay on the wooden plank, while Lucian and Old Ma sat opposite each other. The carriage was spacious enough and they sat comfortably. They heard the sound of the wheels rolling along the way. They gradually moved from the quiet mountains to the road, and as they gradually approached the huge and bustling immortal city, more and more people came and went around the carriage and there were all kinds of sounds. Listening to the various sounds that came from outside the carriage, Lucian suddenly said, "Where are we going?" Old Ma said, "Hall leader Shui has already made arrangements. Through secret means he found a spacious house for us. It will not attract attention. We will go and stay there first and then we will move slowly." Lucian nodded and said, "After all, this immortal city is Zhengxianmeng's territory. It is convenient to do things and the speed is much faster than other places." Old Ma glanced at him but shook his head and said, "You are wrong about this." Lucian was a little surprised and said, "What do you mean?" Old Ma looked out of the window through the curtain and said, "You rarely come here. Even if you come occasionally because your identity is hidden, you will not come into contact with the people here in Zhengxianmeng, so you do not understand the current situation. Now in this immortal city, Zhengxianmeng, there are scenes of overcrowding everywhere. There are all kinds of big and small yamen in the immortal city, and there are countless redundant officials. To do a simple thing they have to worship a lot of bodhisattvas, make people break their legs and then accept bribes and money to do things. It is a common practice." Speaking of this, Old Ma smiled thoughtfully and said, "Normally speaking, if we want to buy such a house through ordinary means and we don't give them money, and we just do things according to the proper rules, let alone 2 days, it will take at least 2 months. Lucian frowned and said after a moment of silence, "According to what you said, what if I go to do something and say that it was the damn Baldy who gave me the task? Will those people speed up?" Old Ma hesitated and seemed to be thinking for a moment. Then he said, With the reputation of a perfected immortal, maybe it can be done faster by 10 days. Lucian couldn't help but laugh and said, "The damn Baldy's reputation can only be faster by 10 days? Old Ma also laughed and said, "More or less. These things are too small and too complicated, but there are rules to follow. You, a perfected immortal, can't be too serious with your subordinates. It's embarrassing enough, so it's more or less like this." Lucian sighed and said, "Then why can it be so fast this time?" It seems that Hall leader Shui seems to be different from others? Yes, in the Immortal Alliance, Fuyunji is sometimes like an anomaly. He does things quickly, and his level of command is far better than the other halls. But because of this, our hall leader Shuang has also been criticized a lot. People say that she likes to be in the limelight, is arrogant, and flatters perfected immortals and so on. However, this is what I think about this matter. He raised his head to look at Lu Chen and said indifferently, a person whose hands are stained with blood will always move faster than those mediocre people, right? Lu Chen nodded and said, you are right. Chapter 394. There were no city walls in the Immortal City. Other than the majestic celestial dragon mountain standing tall on the north side, the east, west and south sides were all flat plains. A few large rivers flowed through the plains, and the fertile land was filled with undulating buildings and pavilions. The bustling place could be said to be unparalleled in the world. This was the largest city in the vast land of the Divine Prefecture, and also the city with the largest population in history. Hundreds of millions of creatures gathered here, and the countless joys and sorrows of the human world played out. Perhaps it was because this place was too prosperous and flourishing that there was no city wall in the world that could encircle it. It was like the legendary divine tree that had existed since the beginning of the world, growing uncontrollably and wildly. There were ancient ruins in the Immortal City, and the scale of these ruins was extremely large. There were many traces of ruins on the surface, and the scale of the ruins underground was even larger. There were countless secrets hidden inside, and perhaps there were countless treasures. Of course, there could also be countless dangers and monsters. For so many years, the legend about this ancient ruins had long been deeply rooted in people's hearts, and there were countless versions of it. However, at this time the rumors were ultimately just gossip, because the big shots of Zhang Xianming had cast a spell to seal this ancient ruins many years ago. When the carriage entered the streets of the Immortal City and steadily moved forward, through the curtains on the carriage, Lu Chen's gaze passed over the houses of different heights on both sides of the street, and saw a very tall but obviously broken statue in the distance. It had huge fangs and a mighty aura. Standing on top of the city, it seemed to overlook all living things, and it had its own domineering aura, like a giant beast pouncing on one's face. Lu Chen stared in that direction from afar in the carriage. Suddenly his heart skipped a beat. He felt that the already broken eye of the giant beast on the statue seemed to have suddenly come to life at a certain moment, and looked into the carriage. It was like a shocking roar in the dark, suddenly exploding in one's mind, causing one's body to suddenly turn cold. But very quickly, that feeling receded like the tide, and there was no more sound, as if it was a dream. Lu Chen's gaze did not leave the statue. After looking at it in silence for a while, he suddenly asked Old Ma, "Is that a white tiger?" Old Ma looked back at the window, then nodded and said, "Well, yes. The place we're going to this time is in the White Tiger District. That mythological beast statue is too tall. No matter how far it is, as long as you are here, you can probably see it if you raise your head. I guess it's the same in our residence." Lu Chen glanced at Old Ma, and a glimmer of light flashed in the depths of his eyes. "How did you feel when you looked at the white tiger statue?" Old Ma was startled for a moment. Then he shrugged and smilingly said, "What can I feel? It's nothing more than a sigh. This statue, together with the other 3 giant statues of mythological beasts in the Immortal City, is said to be originally from this relic. It's just that after so many years, no one can figure out its origin." Lu Chen nodded, his gaze slightly drooping. His expression seemed to have some subtle changes, but very quickly returned to normal. He nodded and said, "Indeed, the person who could create such a giant statue must also be an incomparably powerful race." Old Ma chuckled and said, "Most likely. But who knows, no matter how powerful they are, there are no traces of them now. Perhaps they have encountered some natural or man-made disaster, and have already perished." The sound of the carriage carried them away, leaving only the giant white tiger statue that stood majestically under the sunlight. It still stood there motionlessly, as if it was still waiting for something in the quiet years. Their new residence in the Immortal City was still very good. It was on the side of a gentle tributary of the Mirror River, one of the 4 major rivers. This was the depths of the White Tiger District, and the surroundings had long been filled with houses. The carriage first crossed a stone bridge called Horse Washing Bridge, and then went down to a fork in the road. There was a street with 2 opposite alleys. The alley on the left was called Stoneflower Alley. This name sounded a little strange, and no one knew when it was given this name, but it was clearly written as such on the road sign. Entering Stoneflower Alley, there was a row of houses of various sizes. Most of them looked like large mansions with clear facades. There were about 11 or 12 families. The carriage took them all the way to the deepest part of the alley and stopped at the door. The old and lean coachman got off the carriage, went forward to open the door and directly drove the carriage in. When the door closed, Lu Qin, Old Ma and Black Dog jumped down from the carriage, and after that their new home was revealed in front of them. It looked like an ordinary house with 2 entrances. On the outside there was a living room, a few small rooms, and it looked like an ordinary family's kitchen, storeroom and the like. On the inside there were 2 rooms in the east and west, and a courtyard in the middle, surrounded by a veranda, just enough for one person to have 1 bedroom. The whole house was clean and tidy and very quiet. It looked like a good place to live. Obviously, when Shuiying from Fiyunji arranged this matter, she had put in a lot of thought. After bringing them here, the old coachman quickly took his leave, and it looked like he was not willing to stay for a long time. It seemed that these 2 people were scourges in his eyes, and if they stayed too long they might get into trouble. The courtyard was not very big, but it was enough for Atsu to stroll around for a while. Lu Qin did not care that Atsu was curiously sniffing and running around the house, and turned to Old Ma and said, "Are we going to stay here?" "Yes, what do you think?" Old Ma replied. Lu Qin said, "It's okay anyway, we don't really care about this." "Alright, where are the other things?" Old Ma said, "They said that they have everything arranged. They should be placed somewhere in this house." "Oh," Lu Qin said, "looking for it?" The 2 of them walked together. They first went to look at the bedroom, and after they were satisfied they walked through the entire house. Finally, they found the neatly piled goods in a storeroom in front of them. There were so many of them that they looked like a small mountain, and they were about to fill the storeroom to the brim. Other than some daily necessities, most of the things here were food, and they were all neatly stacked. Then, they quickly realized that there was a large amount of valuable demon beast flesh. Obviously, the people in Fiyunji had found out about what Lu Qin said previously. Standing at the door of the storeroom and looking at this small mountain, that was much taller than their heads, Lu Qin and Old Ma looked at each other and were speechless for a while. After a while, Lu Qin suddenly said, "Look at this and think about the 10 years that we lived in Qingshitang village, those hard times. Damn, isn't the difference in our lives too big?" Old Ma looked like he was gritting his teeth and he said bitterly, "Fiyunji is actually so rich here. Damn. I suffered for 10 years for nothing." Lu Qin clicked his tongue and looked at Old Ma with a faint smile. Then he patted his shoulder and turned around. Old Ma was still depressed and he glared at the full storeroom angrily. Suddenly he slammed the door shut and followed behind Lu Qin. At the same time he scolded, "Corruption." Chapter 395. What was a house? It was just a piece of land surrounded by 4 walls. A few rooms were built and a few beds were placed. One could sleep peacefully and shelter them from the wind and rain. Immortal City was the most prosperous place in the world. However, when Lu Qin and Old Ma stayed in their current house, the walls seemed to isolate them from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. The 2 of them chose their own bedrooms. Lu Qin then went to the storeroom and took out a large piece of meat from an unknown demonic beast and threw it to Atu. As expected, this fellow ran to the courtyard with the piece of meat in his mouth and lay down on the grass by the side of the wall. Then, he began to enjoy the delicious meal by himself with a satisfied expression. When Lu Qin and Old Ma finished tidying up their rooms and settled their luggage, it was already dusk when they returned to the courtyard. They sat at the original stone table and stone bench in the courtyard. Old Ma took out a tea set as if he was performing a magic trick. The kitchen in front of them was boiling hot water, so they made tea together. Lu Qin was a little surprised. He smiled and said, "You actually carry these things with you. I remember that you used to like to drink with me, right?" Old Ma nodded and poured him a full cup of tea. He said, "It's just a habit that I've developed in the past few years. I'm old now, so I don't like to drink much." Lu Qin's hand that was holding the teacup paused in midair. Then he put it to his mouth and took a sip as if nothing had happened. He smiled and said, "How old are you? You have the nerve to say that you're old?" He smacked his lips as if he was savoring the aftertaste. After a moment he said, "This tea is not bad." Old Ma smiled, then sighed and said, "How can we not be old? We've been in this business for more than 10 or 20 years. The 2 of us can actually be considered to have lived a long life." Lu Qin thought for a moment, then nodded and said, "Yes, I think so." Old Ma clicked his tongue and narrowed his eyes as if he was recalling something from the past. He said, I remember when I first entered the industry, people told me that if I did well, I would have power and wealth, and that it would be a shortcut to heaven. But no one told me that most people in this industry would have short lives. Haha, wasn't it the damned Baldy who pulled you into the business? Lu Chen asked with a smile. Seeing old Ma shaking his head, Lu Chen seemed to have recalled something. He smiled and said, "Of course I was dragged into this by that damn Baldy. Back then he didn't talk to me about power and wealth. From the beginning to the end he only talked to me about justice and the heavenly Tao." Old Ma couldn't help but laugh and shake his head. Lu Chen smiled and said, "It's funny, isn't it? But you don't say I really believed him at that time. And if I didn't have this belief, maybe I wouldn't have been able to come back alive from the devil cult." Old Ma smiled and looked at Lu Chen with a gentle and secret pity. He picked up the teapot and poured a cup of tea for him. Lu Chen tapped his fingers on the stone table and looked up at the dusk scenery in the sky. He was lost in thought and didn't speak for a while. After a while, he suddenly heard Old Ma ask, "Then when did you stop believing in these things?" Lu Chen rolled his eyes, squinted at him, pointed at him and said with a smile, "It was when I lived with you for 10 years. Old Ma quickly spat and said, "Don't talk nonsense, it has nothing to do with me. You don't dare to go out and say this. If it reaches Jinjuan's ears he will definitely kill me." Lu Chen laughed. Old Ma shook his head and sighed, "I'm old, I really don't want to do it anymore. What about you? I remember you told me before that you don't seem to have the energy. Why did you come all the way here to meet Jinjuan and then decide to do it again?" Lu Chen raised his head and finished the tea in his cup, as if he had just gulped down a bowl of strong liquor. Then he let out a light breath and said with a smile, "That damned Baldy begged me but I couldn't put aside my pride. Well, maybe I still believe a little of what you just said about the justice of the common people. It would be strange if I believed you." Old Ma scolded with a smile. Night came and everyone went back to their rooms. After the door was closed, there was only silence and darkness. Atsu's body was now too big, it could no longer stay in bed with Lu Chen like before, so it was naturally chased to the ground. Fortunately, this big black dog had the bloodline of the celestial wolf and was now a holy beast, so it was completely unafraid of the cold on the ground. In addition, it had eaten a large piece of demon beast meat today, so it was full of energy. So soon Lu Chen heard the sound of snoring coming from Atsu. It seemed that it had fallen asleep. But Lu Chen couldn't sleep. He lay on the bed, opened his eyes and quietly looked at the darkness. Until dawn. The next morning, Old Ma knocked on the door and said to Lu Chen, "I'm going to find Shuang today, do you want to come?" At this time Lu Chen had just gotten up and the lazy dog Atsu was still lying on the ground, snoring. No one knew how long it would sleep for. Lu Chen called Old Ma to the courtyard and asked, "What's so urgent? We just moved in yesterday, and you're going to find her today?" "I'm going to ask her for money," Old Ma said confidently. Lu Chen was startled and said, "What money? Didn't she already help us settle down here? The food and necessities are also enough." Old Ma sneered and said, "This time we are people who are going to do big things. How can we not have money and spirit stones? Besides, do you think she's so kind as to arrange so many things for us for no reason?" Lu Chen suddenly became a little curious and asked with a smile, "What do you mean?" Old Ma pointed to the north. From afar, the majestic and tall Mount Tianlong stood majestically like a giant guarding this huge city. And at the foot of Mount Tianlong was where the headquarters of Zheng Xianming was located. That's because after I went to report your arrival to the Immortal, he personally promised that we would be satisfied this time. As long as we work hard we will be treated well. Lu Chen's eyes lit up and he clapped his hands and laughed. "I see. Looks like we can get more than just this, of course." Old Ma rolled his eyes and said, "Just wait and see. If we don't say it, Shuang definitely won't give us money. This time I'm going to get at least 1 or 2,000 spirit stones to spend first." Lu Chen interrupted him and said, "Are you stupid? You only want 1 or 2,000 spirit stones from a divine transformation immortal. At 10 times that." Old Ma sucked in a breath of cold air and widened his eyes. "Isn't it too much to ask for so much? If I anger Shuang she might kick me out on the spot." Lu Chen sneered, "This money doesn't belong to her. Needless to say it must be from Zheng Xianming. If we don't want it we'll naturally spend it elsewhere. Plus, don't you want to have tens of thousands of spirit stones in your hands and walk around the immortal city with us?" Old Ma's expression changed. After a moment he clapped his hands and said fiercely, "You're right. How can we do things without money? That kind of big thing can only be done with a lot of money." Lu Chen nodded repeatedly and said, "You've finally understood. Congratulations." Old Ma chuckled and turned to walk out. But after a few steps, he suddenly looked back at Lu Chen and said, "Hey Lu Chen." Old Ma said, "When you were chatting with me yesterday you said something about justice for all the people in the world and so on. Maybe you still believe it in your heart?" Lu Chen frowned and said, "Yes, I did." "What?" Old Ma said sternly, "Forget about these things. Trust me, you don't believe in these things anymore. Get lost." Chapter 396. After Old Ma went out, the house suddenly became much quieter. Lu Chen returned to the courtyard and sat down. He glanced at his bedroom. Through the open door he could see that Atsu, the big lazy dog, was still lying on the ground, snoring loudly. It seemed that the demon beast meat that Shuang asked people to prepare yesterday was of high quality. Only after eating this kind of high-quality demon beast meat that was full of spiritual power would Atsu become so sleepy. In fact, it was because its body had absorbed too much spiritual power and needed more time to digest it. The corner of Lu Chen's mouth twitched slightly and he shook his head. It made him feel a little helpless. 4 demon beasts like Atsu, which had the incomparably powerful celestial wolf bloodline, as long as it had enough good food, it could often increase its strength just by sleeping. As for the human race, who were now known as the rulers of the divine continent, if they wanted to obtain stronger power, they had to cultivate for their entire lives. Even the powerful divine transformation stage true monarchs were the same. Every cultivator would almost never stop cultivating throughout their lives. Cultivation was like rowing a boat against the current. If one did not advance, one would fall back. Was this another way of saying that humans were inferior to dogs? Well, at least this dog was stupid. As Lu Chen thought of this, he felt a little better. He couldn't help but laugh at himself. After that, he stood up and carefully looked around before walking back to his bedroom and closing the door behind him. After the door was closed, the light in the room became a little darker. However, Atsu, who was sleeping on the ground, didn't notice this. Of course, it could have been aware of this, but with Lu Chen by its side, it was enough to let it relax and sleep peacefully. Lu Chen locked the door, then returned to the side of the bed and lay down. His face was calm as he regulated his breathing. After a while, he put his hand on his chest and closed his eyes. With a hum sound, a white light lit up. At that moment, the light in the space above the bed seemed to distort rapidly. After a moment, Lu Chen's body disappeared. Only a seed quietly fell from the air and gently landed on the soft bedding without making a sound. In the ancient and mysterious tree hole, the same white light flashed, and then Lu Chen's body appeared in the hole. Because he had been here too many times and was too familiar with this place, Lu Chen almost subconsciously adjusted his body in midair. He used his hand to lightly press the ground, and his whole body nimbly stood up. The gray and misty floating tree walls, the quiet and clear puddles, and some of the things he had piled up in the corner looked the same as before. Nothing had changed. Of course, there was also a sense of quietness or perhaps loneliness. Lu Chen looked around and walked to the water hole in the center of the tree hole. He squatted down and looked into the water. Many years ago, this puddle of water used to be a dark green color filled with dense vitality. Now it had reduced to transparent and colorless ripples. There used to be nothing in the water, but now there were 2 things. One was a strange black fire that was still burning in the water, and the other was an aquatic spirit plant. It was the black mud lotus that Atsu stole in Kunlun Mountain. Lu Chen hadn't paid attention to the movement here for a while. Today, after coming over to take a closer look, he suddenly frowned slightly. He found something unusual. The cluster of black fire was similar to before. There wasn't much change, but the black mud lotus that was originally placed in the water to preserve the quality of its spiritual power seemed to have changed significantly. At some point, one end of the black mud lotus had already pierced into the soil at the bottom of the puddle, while the other end was slightly raised. Looking at the tiny roots that had begun to grow out of the lotus, this aquatic spirit plant seemed to have settled down in the puddle and had begun to germinate again. This made Lu Chen a little surprised. When that stupid dog Atsu stole this spirit plant, he didn't think about preserving it. He dug it out directly and crudely, directly biting off all the original roots. He didn't expect that the black mud lotus could be reborn here. It seemed to be a spirit plant with a very tenacious vitality. But soon, Lu Chen found that there seemed to be something wrong with this black mud lotus. It seemed to be a bit too black. As the name suggested, the black mud lotus grew in the mud and most of the spirit plants were black in color. This was indeed the case, but in Lu Chen's eyes, the black color had changed a lot compared to the original color. The black color on the body of the black mud lotus was deep and translucent. It was far from the grade of an ordinary spirit plant. It could even be said that the black mud lotus looked like a piece of flawless black jade, with a bit of crystal clarity. This kind of color and light was not ordinary at first glance. But what made Lu Chen's expression more serious was that through the surface of the bright and translucent black, he could faintly feel a familiar aura that quietly resonated with a certain dark power in his body. The power of the black fire? Lu Chen raised his head and looked around the tree hole, then looked at the black fire in the water. For a moment he couldn't tell if the black fire had infected the black mud lotus, or if the tree hole itself had some kind of mysterious power that he didn't know. He silently pondered for a long time. In the end he didn't touch the obviously mutated spirit plant and stood up. He walked to the edge of the tree hole, stretched out a hand and gently stroked the tree wall. He slowly walked forward. The ancient and rough tree wall left a faint response in his palm, but his eyes were looking forward. Seed branch? In the silence he said to himself, if this is really a part of the tree of God, then it's probably only 2 leaves away from the evil sect's legendary miracle? There was only silence in the tree hole, and only his voice echoed. Lu Chen raised his head and found that he had already walked to the bottom of the 2 hidden doors on the tree wall. He stared at the door for a long time and suddenly said, the legendary tree of God has a spirit. If you were its seed, what would you think? Would you want that leaf to come back here? The tree hole was still silent. The green gas on the tree wall slowly floated and drifted, as if a little uneasy, but also as if there was nothing unusual. Lu Chen shook his head, turned and walked towards the water hole ready to leave. But just as he stepped on the edge of the puddle, the pupils in his eyes suddenly shrank. He abruptly stopped and looked forward. He saw that in this ancient tree hole, the originally slow and misty green gas on the tree wall suddenly floated rapidly, and then rushed from all directions in one direction. That direction was right behind him. Lu Chen's body trembled, and after a moment he suddenly turned around. At this moment, a strange buzzing sound suddenly rang out in the originally quiet tree hole. It sounded like the sound of the wind, but it also sounded like the whistling of the wind. In this strange sound, all the green gas on the tree walls rushed towards one direction, and it was impressively one of the 2 strange doors. On that strange door, the green gas gathered together, rolling and twisting incessantly, changing into all kinds of indescribable forms. Until the last moment, all of the green gas gradually slowed down, condensed into a pattern, reflected in the air in front of Lu Chen's eyes. Lu Chen's face suddenly turned a little strange, a little pale. Perhaps he had suddenly discovered the secret of this tree hole that had never appeared before, or perhaps he had thought of something even further away. He stood in the tree hole for a while, then slowly nodded his head and turned around without saying a word. Boo! A faint white light flashed. This person disappeared in this ancient tree hole. After a moment, the green gas slowly dispersed, reintegrated, adhered to the tree wall, scattered and drifted to every corner, and once again became the same as before. It was as if nothing had happened. Chapter 397. Old Ma came back in the evening. When he entered the backyard he saw Lu Chen sitting there and drinking by himself. Atsu had woken up from its sleep, but at this moment, it had slipped to the corner of the courtyard wall and was happily gnawing on a large piece of meat. Needless to say, this was the food that Lu Chen had given it. "Tsk tsk tsk tsk?" Old Ma exclaimed, then walked to Lu Chen's side and sat down. Looking at Atsu he said to Lu Chen, "A dog that eats a large piece of high-grade demonic beast meat every day, even in a place like the Immortal City where there are countless rich people, it is definitely rare. The 2 of us can't do it, but this dog can definitely be ranked at the top of the dog clan in the Immortal City." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Are you still jealous of this dog, Atsu? Humans are inferior to dogs." Old Ma sighed, then turned his head. However, Lu Chen waved his hand, raised his eyebrows and said casually, "Don't talk nonsense. Now, Atsu can eat so freely because of Fiyunji. Anyway, it's not our money. A house full of demonic beast meat is expensive, and it's all public property. It's a waste not to eat it." Old Ma curled his lips, looking a little disdainful, and said, "With your selfish thoughts at the expense of the public, you still dared to talk to me about the righteous path of the common people yesterday. Don't you feel guilty?" Hearing the words, "the righteous path of the common people," before Old Ma's voice fell, Lu Chen hurriedly said with a serious expression, "I am brave and upright, don't speak nonsense to slander me. And those are 2 completely different things. Atsu eating meat has nothing to do with my righteous path. Old Ma nodded repeatedly and said, "Yes, yes, I believe you, I believe you." Lucien laughed. After a while he patted Old Ma's shoulder and asked with a smile, "Don't talk about this. Did you get anything today?" "I've gained a lot." Old Ma replied with a smile, looking very happy. "When I went to look for Hall Leader Shui, I was too embarrassed to tell him the amount of money we wanted," said Old Ma with a sigh. Lucien snorted and said rudely, "Cut the crap. I've known you for more than 10 years and I've never seen you so shy. It would be strange if you didn't say it." Old Ma was furious and shouted, "Bullshit. How could I be such a person?" Lucien nodded slowly and confidently. "You are indeed this kind of person. Otherwise, why would you go to Fiyunji?" Old Ma was startled, but he didn't get angry. After thinking for a while, he actually nodded and said, "What you said seems to make some sense." Lucien waved his hand and said, "Tell me, how much money did you ask for? And what was Shui Ying's reaction? Did she agree?" Old Ma said, "At that time I mustered up my courage. Hey, can you not look at me like that?" Alright, I thickened my face and told her that we were going to do something big and needed money, so we needed 30,000 spiritual stones. "I'll go." Lucien was holding a glass of wine in his hand. Hearing this, he almost spilled the wine on himself. With great difficulty, he grabbed the glass firmly and immediately raised his head to stare at Old Ma. "What did you say? How much was it again?" Old Ma laughed dryly and stretched out 3 fingers. 30,000 spiritual stones. Lucien sized up Old Horse's fat body from head to toe and then sighed, "It's been so many years, but I still haven't seen through you. Damn fat pig, you're even more thick-skinned and black-hearted than I thought." It's fine if you say I'm thick-skinned and black-hearted, but don't call me a fat pig and curse me." Old Ma sat there and protested unhappily. Lucien snorted again. At this time he casually poured the wine in his hand into his mouth and said sarcastically, "Yesterday didn't you only ask for 1 or 2,000 spiritual stones? Let me tell you, why don't you ask for 10 or 20,000? You ran over yourself and actually added another 10,000 spiritual stones. This is too." For a moment he didn't know what to say and could only shake his head. Old Ma shrugged and looked like he was ready to risk everything. "This is what I think. Anyway, at this point, there is not much difference between 10,000, 20,000, and 30,000. Why not say 30,000? First, ask for a sky-high price and then wait for her to return the money." Lucien nodded and smiled. What you said makes a lot of sense. Now please tell me, how did our hall leader Shui Ying react when she heard your price?" "She sat there for a long time and didn't move. After staring at me for a while, she kicked me over and then chased me out." Old Ma said honestly and spread his hands. "This is what you meant by a big gain?" Lucien looked at Old Ma unhappily. Old Ma grunted. He thought for a moment and said, "At least we know that Shui Ying can't give us 30,000 spiritual stones, right? Next time when we ask for money we'll just ask for less." Lucien put his hand on his forehead. He didn't want to look at his friend anymore. When the sky gradually darkened, countless houses in the corners of the immortal city lit up one after another. Looking from afar, this city didn't show any signs of being quiet in the night. Instead, it looked even more brilliant under the night sky. Even the night seemed to become noisy and lively under the contrast of this city. Perhaps this was a city that didn't sleep. In the night, many interesting or strange things would appear. Some of these things didn't exist during the day. For example, there were many different shops that closed during the day and only opened at night. In the immortal city, people usually called these places that only opened at night nightclubs. Lucien and Old Ma walked on the flat and spacious streets of the immortal city in the night. Looking at the bustling crowd around them, they felt a little emotional. At Qingshiteng village, the entire village should be asleep by now, right? Old Ma turned and asked Lucien. "Definitely. In that shabby village there's nothing to do but sleep." Lucien looked at the lively scene around him with interest and sighed. Old Ma laughed happily and said, "Hey, seriously, after we finish this job and earn a lot of money, we'll find a corner in this immortal city to stay. What do you think?" He sighed and said, "There's probably no better place in the world than here." Lucien said, "Wake up. This is naturally the best place in the world, but the people who can live a good life here are all top rich people. Don't you know how much the housing prices in this immortal city are? What right do you have to think about this?" Old Ma was stunned. After a moment of silence, he revealed a dejected expression and said, "You're right. It seems like we really can't afford it. So don't think about it. Let's go. There's a nightclub in front. Let's go and take a look." Lucian pulled old Ma and walked forward with a smile. Old Ma also chuckled, but then he seemed to think of something and asked Lucian worriedly, "Oh right, the two of us ran out like this and left Atsu alone at home. Isn't that bad?" "It's fine." Lucian said absent-mindedly, "Don't worry. That guy will sleep until dawn after he's full. He'll be fine." Old Ma glanced at him, then nodded and said, "Oh." At this time, Lucian's eyes suddenly lit up. He pointed to somewhere in front of them and said with a smile, "We're here. I've long heard that the nightclubs in the Immortal City are unparalleled in the world. Let's come and broaden our horizons today." Old Ma turned his head and saw a brilliant and bustling scene in front of him. Beautiful purple and red flowers bloomed in the night, adding a bit of charm to the night. Red lights swayed and fluttered with the wind. A tall building rose from the ground. Countless young and beautiful faces stretched out their red sleeves and laughed on the building. The night gradually darkened and the lights were brilliant. The light shone over and seemed to pull their figures over, hiding them in the depths of the lights. Chapter 398. What are we doing here? Old Ma stood in front of the warm and fragrant nightclub. He was grinning from ear to ear. His hands kept waving at the gorgeously dressed girls in front of him, and then he asked Lucian in a low voice, "Don't play dumb." Lucian scolded. Old Ma tried to explain. He put his hand on his chest and said seriously, "In fact, I haven't been to such a place for a long time." Lucian was surprised. He looked at the fat man and frowned. "You've been here before?" Old Ma sighed and said, "When I was young, I was frivolous and bored. I would occasionally come to the nightclub. Well, I mainly wanted to find someone to talk to and relieve my troubles." Lucian looked at him more and more disdainfully and said, "You were a frequent visitor to such places when you were young." Old Ma choked for a moment and suddenly became angry out of shame. He glared at Lucian indignantly and said, "Aren't you the same? You come to the nightclub with a familiar look. Do you think I can't see it? Not to mention that you dragged me here tonight." Lucian sneered and waved his hand. "What do you know? I did come to such places in the past, but because I was on the enemy's side, I had to feign civility. Even in such a place I kept my mind clear and was careful for the big things." Old Ma snorted and looked like he didn't believe it. He just said, "Cut the crap. Why did you drag me here tonight?" Lucian thought for a moment and said, "To do something. The thing that the higher-ups want us to find." Old Ma was shocked and his face suddenly became serious. He whispered, "What ye is here? How do you know?" Lucian shook his head and said, "I don't know. It's not that easy to find. What I mean is, we can't find what the damn Baldy wants us to find in a hurry. We can only explore bit by bit. But if he is in those people's hands, maybe what we need to do is to find them first." Old Ma pondered for a moment. Suddenly, his eyes lit up and he said, "You mean through these nightclubs?" Lucian said indifferently, "As time has passed, many of their communication methods must have changed. I don't have much confidence in finding them. However, there are always some things that won't change. For example, after they go into hiding, they will need to do something in the open to make a living. There will probably be people who want to do things that they are familiar with to save energy." Old Ma nodded and said, "That makes sense. Shall we go in and give it a try?" "Okay." Lucian walked forward with his hands behind his back. At the same time he said, "By the way, I don't have any money with me." Old Ma was startled and suddenly became nervous. He was about to speak when he suddenly saw Lucian turn his head and smile. He whispered, "Look at the expenses here tonight. Tomorrow we will go to Shui Ying's place and try to get more money to spend." Old Ma chuckled and his worries turned into joy. He nodded as if he had suddenly realized something. "Of course." She sang and danced gracefully. Her smile was like a blossoming flower, and the fragrance of makeup and powder permeated the air. In a trance there was a sudden feeling of emptiness. Lucian hugged the smiling woman beside him and smiled as he drank the wine in his glass. The wine was mellow with a trace of bitterness as it burned down his throat. He looked ahead and saw that Old Ma was just like him. He was all smiles and seemed to be in high spirits. He was hugging two young girls, eating fruits and drinking wine. Drinking wine in the land of warmth and gentleness was like being drunk several times in life. Lucian raised his head and looked out the window. The moonlight was just right. The bright moon hung in the sky. It was the best time of the night. He smiled and stood up. His eyes were a little intoxicated. He first whispered to the woman beside him and then reached out to touch her cheek. The girl actually blushed and looked a little shy. She did not stop him. Then Luchin walked out. His steps were a little weak. At the same time he smiled at old Ma and said, "You have fun. I'm going to relieve myself. I'll be back in a moment." Old Ma laughed but did not seem to have time to answer him. He went back to the land of warmth and gentleness. The girls beside him covered their mouths and chuckled. They opened the door for Luchin and pointed him in the direction. Luchin staggered. He seemed to be drunk. His face was a little red. He walked down the stairs. Under the red lantern his figure looked a little hazy but also a little lonely. It was already late at night. Even though the nightclub was still in the middle of a party, the courtyard downstairs was still surrounded by darkness and silence. Luchin quietly turned around from the darkness. As the darkness swallowed his figure, his eyes suddenly became clear and bright. His eyes also became sharp as he coldly looked around. He examined the quiet courtyard. There were rockery, ponds, trees and bushes of flowers. There were sounds of laughter coming from the pavilion in the distance. If he listened carefully he would probably be able to tell that one or two of the voices belonged to that damned fatty. Luchin moved his body in the darkness. Like a shadow passing by, he came to the side of a few trees in the courtyard. He quickly but carefully examined them. He even touched the roots of several trees with his hand. But after a moment he stood up and seemed to have found nothing. Luchin took a few steps forward. This time he came to the side of the pond in the courtyard. There was a stone railing here. Luchin bent down and put his hand directly into the water. He pressed a few times under the water. A few ripples spread out. Luchin didn't know what he sensed in the water, but he quickly jumped up and returned to his original position. He looked like a guest standing by the side of a pond looking at the scenery in the water. The moon in the sky was originally reflected in the water. But at this moment there were some ripples. It was a little messy and began to shake. In the courtyard ahead there were two figures talking and laughing. They stopped about 10 feet in front of him. With the moonlight it seemed that they were two girls. "Mister, why are you standing here?" a young girl asked Luchin with a surprised look on her face when she saw him. Luchin put his hand on his forehead and shook his head. "I drank too much. I came out for a walk." The two girls looked at each other and then said at the same time, "Then let us help you back." Okay. After an hour, the two men walked out of this gentle place and walked to their home in the distance under the cover of the night. "Hey, why are you so strange?" When there was no one else around and only the two of them were on the long and dark street, old Ma said to Luchin angrily, "People who go to the nightclub to play at this time, why would they leave and go home?" Luchin said with a smile, "I'm worried about Atsu. I'd better go back and have a look." Old Ma snorted and said, "Don't talk nonsense. Tell me the truth." Luchin said, "This is not the place we are looking for. Let's go." Old Ma was startled. The drunkenness on his face seemed to have sobered up a little. He said, "Are you sure?" Luchin said, "Yeah, more or less." Old Ma looked at him and suddenly said, "You seem to have changed a lot since you came back." Luchin looked at him and said, "What do you mean?" Old Ma did not answer him. He only walked forward in silence for a while. Then he suddenly said, "When you were in Qingshiteng village, did you go to see Ding Dang?" "Yes, I did." "Yeah, how was it?" "There was grass growing on the grave. I pulled it out for her and tidied it up. I also talked to her for a while." Old Ma looked at him. He wanted to say something but stopped. Then he sighed and walked forward. "Let's go home." Chapter 399. In the dark of the night, Luchin and old Ma walked side by side. For a while neither of them spoke. Just like that they walked across the long street. When they reached the horse-washing bridge, old Ma suddenly stopped in the middle of the bridge and listened for a while, then looked down. Luchin paused and said, "Why aren't you walking?" Old Ma pointed to the river under the bridge and said, "Look, doesn't this river look like Qingshui Creek?" Qingshui Creek was the stream in Qingshiteng village. Luchin and old Ma had lived there for 10 years, so of course they knew. He walked to the edge of the bridge and looked down. He saw that the tributary was indeed very calm and quiet. In the darkness of the night, there was almost no sound of water splashing. It was really similar to the small stream in the mountain village in the past. However, Luchin did not laugh. He only looked at the stream under his feet. After a while he shook his head and said, "This river is much bigger than Qingshui Creek and much deeper. It doesn't look like it." Old Ma was startled. A trace of surprise flashed across his face. His expression was also a little complicated. After a while, he seemed to sigh and said, "Seems like you don't miss the 10 years you lived in Qingshiteng village." "There's nothing to miss." Luchin said faintly, "In those 10 years, We just hid like turtles, desperately avoiding the pursuit of the devil cult. Day and night we were always like a string that was stretched taut. When we saw a stranger we would suspect whether he was a killer or not. What's so good about these days of fear? He paused for a while and turned his head to look into the distance. After a moment of silence he said, not to mention that I still had my old injuries. Every now and then they would act up and it was unbearable. So you want to ask me about those 10 years? I don't like it at all. Old Ma nodded silently and said, what you said does make sense. But as far as I'm concerned, sometimes I feel that staying in Qingshitang village for 10 years made me far away from right and wrong, far away from scheming, not to mention killing and arson for a living. So now that I think about it, I don't think those days were too hard. Lu Chen looked at him and suddenly smiled. Why did you suddenly think of the past? Old Ma also laughed. He patted the stone railing on the bridge beside him, then walked forward and said, I'm probably a little old. He walked down the bridge, but when he was 5 or 6 steps away, he suddenly heard Lu Chen call him from behind. Old Ma stopped and turned around in surprise. What's wrong? Lu Chen walked over and frowned slightly. Looking at Old Ma's face, his expression seemed to be more serious and dignified than before. He said, you've said this to me several times recently. You're not in a good mood. Is that so? Old Ma was a little surprised. It seemed like he didn't notice what Lu Chen said. Lu Chen stared at him for a while and then said calmly, don't say this again, especially not in front of our perfected cultivator, understand? Old Ma's expression changed slightly as if he thought of something. The corner of his mouth twitched as if he wanted to say something, but he saw that Lu Chen had already turned around and walked towards the alley. Looking at Lu Chen's back, Old Ma wanted to say something but stopped himself. For a moment, his expression seemed to have become unusually subtle and complicated. After returning to the residence, or rather back to their home, they didn't say a word. When the door was closed and they were finally separated from the outside world, they probably felt a sense of relief. In the deep courtyard at night, their rooms were far away from each other. When they arrived here, Lu Chen first greeted Old Ma and was ready to return to his room. But at this time, Old Ma suddenly stopped him and looked at the door saying, where's Atsu? Is he still sleeping inside? Lu Chen smiled and said, it's so quiet around here. He's probably still sleeping like a dead pig. Old Ma also smiled, but he quickly put away his smile and said to Lu Chen, what you said to me just now is quite good. I'll remember it all. Lu Chen nodded with a smile and didn't say anything. Old Ma hesitated for a moment and said, but tonight I actually have a question in my heart that I want to ask you. Lu Chen said, well, go ahead. Old Ma looked at his eyes and said, it's still the same question, why did you choose that nightclub? Without waiting for Lu Chen to explain, he waved his hand and said, we already have this kind of relationship, you don't have to say those nonsense to me. Immortal City is so huge and prosperous, there are countless nightclubs of all sizes. Even though we may have the opportunity to find traces of the evil sect's evil people on this road, but no matter what, it's impossible to really find them one by one like this. He stared at Lu Chen and slowly said, so, how did you determine that it was that nightclub? Or is it that you're actually just saying it casually and just went there to have fun? Lu Chen's eyes slightly drooped, and after a moment he suddenly smiled and said, actually I just went there to have fun, and to see if there's any chance to find any traces, but if there's none then forget it. Old Ma seemed a little surprised and said in astonishment, really like this? Yes. Lu Chen said, those people from the evil sect are not so easy to find, otherwise wouldn't the remnants of the evil sect in this immortal city have long been caught and killed by Shuang? Old Ma hesitated for a moment, then nodded and said, yes, you're right. Lu Chen laughed, turned around and walked towards his own bedroom, and at the same time said with a smile, go back early and rest, don't think too much. Lu Chen, do you really believe what True Monarch said? Old Ma suddenly interrupted him. Lu Chen's footsteps were 3 steps away from his door when he suddenly froze and then stopped. In this quiet and serene courtyard in the dead of night, the two of them looked like illusory shadows. Do you really believe what he said? That legendary tree of God, its branches, leaves, seeds, divine weapons and treasures, and with the power of us mortals, to try to destroy that kind of creation divine object? Do you really believe it? Old Ma's voice reverberated in the courtyard. The darkness around Lu Chen's body suddenly seemed to thicken, as though his body was obscured, making it difficult for people to see his face clearly. After an unknown period of time, Lu Chen was heard saying calmly, I believe it. Old Ma did not speak, only looked at him. Lu Qin waved at him, then turned and walked to the door, pushed it open and walked in. After a moment the two doors closed behind him, blocking old Ma's view. Old Ma's throat moved, his expression seemed a little nervous. After standing silently on the spot for a moment, he also walked out of his bedroom, but when he pushed open the door for some reason, his hand suddenly trembled a little. After a long time with a creak, he pushed open his door and walked in. Standing in his bedroom, Lu Qin noticed at first glance that Atsu did not seem to be sleeping peacefully on the ground. Then he subconsciously looked at the bed and sure enough, he saw a pair of shining green eyes in the darkness looking at him. Lu Qin smiled and walked over to sit on the bed. He hugged Atsu, who had been lying on the bed for some time, and patted its head. Atsu also gently rubbed its head against Lu Qin's body, but suddenly Lu Qin found that Atsu's eyes had never moved away from a certain direction. Even when he just came in, it seemed to be looking at that direction at the door or somewhere outside the door. He glanced at Atsu, the smile on his face slowly disappeared, and his eyes became a little colder. Then he followed Atsu's silent gaze and looked at the closed door. And outside the door, if he remembered correctly, after crossing the dark and deep courtyard, it was old Ma's bedroom. Atsu had been here, staring in that direction. Chapter 400. Old Ma pushed open the door. His body stiffened for a moment, but he still walked in expressionlessly and closed the door behind him. The bedroom was very dark. After all, it was already late at night. However, in the darkness there was a huge figure sitting there silently. It was like a small mountain. At first glance, it even gave people a feeling that they had to look up to it. It was as if the black figure occupied half of the entire room. Old Ma stood at the door with his head lowered and his hands hanging on both sides of his body. He looked very submissive. After a moment, the voice of the dark figure came from the darkness in front of him. It said, "You're back." Old Ma said respectfully, "Yes." "Where did you go tonight?" "I went to a nightclub with Lu Qin." Old Ma answered calmly and clearly. Then, without hiding anything, he told the whereabouts of himself and Lu Qin that night. The dark figure listened silently and did not interrupt at all. It was not until Old Ma finished that he asked, "Is there anything strange about that nightclub?" Old Ma hesitated for a moment and said, "I don't think so. At least, I didn't find anything suspicious. When I came back I asked Lu Qin and he said it wasn't here." The huge dark figure was quiet for a while as if thinking about something. Old Ma seemed to be in awe of the figure. He stood there and waited obediently. After a while, the figure in the dark suddenly moved and seemed to lean forward a little. For some reason at that moment, Old Horse suddenly felt a little dry in his throat. In his daze, he had the illusion of a mountain collapsing on top of him. However, of course, in the darkness there was no real mountain falling down. On the contrary, there was a strange flash of light. If one looked carefully they would find that it should be a shiny bald head. Old Ma lowered his head even more. In front of the bald true monarch he really seemed like a tiny ant. Sometimes he would wonder why Lu Qin seemed to be able to act so freely in front of this giant, who looked up to him, even though Lu Qin looked about the same as him. Lu Qin called him, damn baldy," every day. Old Ma had even seen him curse in front of this immortal. But every time, it seemed that the immortal did not mind and forgave him. It seemed that he was very tolerant of him. Why was that, Xiao Ma? A call in the darkness woke Old Ma up from his thoughts. He quickly answered. In the darkness, immortal Tianlan's eyes were as deep as the sea. It seemed that he could never see what was hidden at the end. He looked at Old Ma and asked, "Do you believe in Lu Qin's words?" Old Ma hesitated for a moment and then asked tentatively, "Which aspect are you talking about? Looking for clues about the nightclub or both? I just want to ask you, do you still believe in him?" Sitting in the darkness, immortal Tianlan said calmly. For some reason, Old Ma suddenly remembered that not long ago, he seemed to have asked Lu Qin almost the same question. Until now, he still remembered Lu Qin's expression when he looked at him. After a moment of silence, he smiled and said to immortal Tianlan respectfully, "Of course I still believe in him." Immortal Tianlan took a deep look at Old Ma and then nodded. He leaned back and disappeared in the darkness again. In the west wing, Lu Qin sat on the bed and Atu lay next to him. In the darkness, the black dog's eyes were bright and full of life, flashing with a dark green light as it stared in the direction of the door. Lu Qin gently stroked the fur on Atsu's back. His eyes flickered slightly as if he was thinking about something. Once Atsu suddenly stood up and seemed to want to run out, but was stopped by Lu Qin. He wrapped his arms around Atu's body. Even though he didn't use much strength, Atu's abnormally strong body stopped immediately. He turned around to look at Lu Chen. Lu Chen's expression was calm. He lowered his voice so that only Atu could hear him. Did you feel something? He pointed at the door. Lu Chen's eyes were wide open. Atu was stunned. Lu Chen's expression was calm. Atsu nodded. Lu Chen smiled and said, "Don't go there. No matter who it is, they probably don't want us to know, whether it's that person's intention or old Ma's. I just want to see what old Ma will say to me tomorrow, or maybe he won't mention it at all." Atsu lowered its head slightly and whispered. Lu Chen shook his head and said with a smile, "Don't worry, I don't think old Ma will hurt me. If he wanted to hurt me, I would have died countless times in the past 10 years. This night was quiet and long, but no one stepped out of their room. In this way, in the silence, they waited for the morning light on the horizon. Facing the morning light, old Ma opened the door and walked into the yard. He stretched his body and suddenly turned his head. He was a little surprised and said, "Hey, you got up so early?" On the other side of the yard, Lu Chen got up earlier than him. At this moment he was holding a piece of monster meat in his hand. He cut it into several pieces with a sharp knife and threw it in front of Atsu, who was drooling. Then he walked over and said with a smile, "I can't help it. This dog felt hungry early in the morning and pestered me for food." Old Ma looked at Atsu with some amazement and said, "Atsu is not simple. He can eat so much. Moreover, that's high-grade demonic beast meat. Even us cultivators can't eat that much every day." Lu Chen waved his hand and said with a smile, "Monsters are animals. They are not smart, so naturally their bodies are better. It's not strange." Old Ma also laughed and then asked Lu Chen to sit down at the stone table in the yard. He looked at him and said, "How did you sleep last night?" A glimmer flashed in the depths of Lu Chen's eyes, but he didn't show it on his face. He said with a smile, "It's okay. I slept until dawn. What about you?" Old Ma said with a smile, "Me too. I'm getting old. When I was young, I used to go to that kind of place to play. Every time I played, I would stay up all night without sleeping. But when I came back yesterday, I fell asleep the moment I went to bed. I don't know anything." Lu Chen was silent for a moment. He nodded and said with a smile, "Not bad, not bad. It's good to sleep well." Old Ma laughed and changed the topic. He said, "What are you going to do next? We have settled down here. Since Lord True Monarch has ordered us to do something, we have to try our best to do something." Lu Chen said, "Of course. I'm also counting on this to get the qualification to retire for the rest of my life from that damn Baldy." He paused for a moment, then smiled and said, "How about this? You should go find Shuaying and ask for a lower price from yesterday. See if you can get some money out of it. This way we can do things easier. As for me, I'll just secretly investigate in the city. See if I can find some clues related to the evil cult." Old Ma looked at him and said, "Do you have a plan?" Lu Chen hesitated for a moment. He said, "I have a little idea. But it's not that simple. I still need to look carefully. If I have enough money, it'll probably be faster." Old Ma looked at him. He nodded and stood up. He said, "Okay. I'll go now." Chapter 401. Old Ma went out, and when he left, he looked both happy and worried. Lu Chen guessed that Old Ma was happy that he might be able to swindle a large sum of money, but worried that he would have to see Shuaying, who was known to be difficult to deal with. He didn't know if he would be chased out in disgrace again. Lu Chen didn't care about this at all. In any case, he wasn't the one going. Old Ma, that damn fatty, was born to do this kind of work. It didn't matter if he was scolded a few times. However, when Old Ma was about to leave, he still very politely and amicably sent him to the door, and watched as Old Ma left the alley. This made Old Ma feel somewhat flattered, and he asked Lu Chen a few questions about whether he had taken the wrong medicine today. Lu Chen just laughed and scolded him. After joking around for a while, he watched Old Ma's figure disappear into the distance of the alley. He turned around and closed the door, then walked all the way back to the courtyard and sat down. Atsu was still lying in the corner of the courtyard, gnawing on the demon beast meat. While he was enjoying it with great relish and satisfaction, he would occasionally raise his head to look at Lu Chen. Lu Chen didn't do anything. He just sat there quietly. The smile on his face disappeared, and he just sat there calmly, expressionless for a long time. The courtyard was silent. After an unknown amount of time, Lu Chen suddenly stood up and walked forward. However, he didn't walk in the direction of his own bedroom. Instead, as if by accident, he went around a corridor and walked to the east wing, which was outside old Ma's room. The door was closed, but it wasn't locked from the outside. Because the person who lived here had gone out to collect debts, the door should be unlocked. It was impossible that the door could be locked from the inside after old Ma left. Lu Chen's footsteps paused in front of old Ma's door. For a moment, there seemed to be a trace of strangeness in the depths of his eyes, but after a moment, he still very calmly reached out his hand, as if he had walked out of his own house, and used his hand to push the door. With a creak, the door gently opened inwards. Sunlight shone from behind Lu Chen, entering the closed bedroom. At the same time, Lu Chen's figure formed a long shadow at the door. Everything in the room was reflected in Lu Chen's eyes. The layout of this room was similar to that of Lu Chen's room in the West Wing. At the very least, the layout, furniture, and decorations were almost the same. Of course, there was no one in the room at the moment. It looked like an ordinary room. Lu Chen didn't immediately step into the room. He stood at the door, and his eyes began to sharpen, scanning every corner of the room little by little. But everything looked so normal and peaceful, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Lu Chen's eyebrows slowly furrowed, as if he was a little hesitant to enter the room to investigate further. But at this moment, Lu Chen suddenly noticed something. Unknowingly, the surroundings had become completely quiet. It was a complete silence without a single sound. If he remembered correctly, not long ago, Atsu was still lying in the corner of the courtyard behind him, happily chewing on pieces of demon beast meat. But at this moment, not even a little sound could be heard. A wave of coldness suddenly arose from his heart and enveloped his entire body like a block of ice. But right when Lu Chen was about to abruptly turn around and put his entire body on guard, a warm voice sounded out from behind him. The voice was deep and gentle, and it even carried a trace of a smile. It was as if the voice had seen a friend and said, "Are you looking for me?" Lu Chen's body suddenly froze. The sun shone on him and there was a warm aura. It seemed to be a good day. Lu Chen took a deep breath and turned around slowly, only to see perfected Lord Tianlan. He was still fat and burly. Just like before, he still liked to sit. He just sat on the grass in the courtyard as if he suddenly occupied half the space of the courtyard. Atu, who had been eating in the corner of the courtyard, was now curled up in a corner, not making a sound. All the hair on his body was standing on end as he stared at the bald, fat man. He seemed extremely nervous. Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then walked over. He first came to Atsu and touched its head. Atsu glanced at him and calmed down, but it was still very vigilant when it looked at Supreme Tianlan. Then Lu Chen walked to Supreme Tianlan and said, "When did you come?" "Just arrived." Perfected Lord Tianlan said with a smile and an amiable expression. Perhaps it was just as old Ma thought, he still regarded Lu Chen with special respect. Lu Chen stared at him for a while and said, "What did you say just now?" "I was looking for you." Supreme Tianlan said, "Didn't you?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then said, "Was it you who came last night?" "Yes, I was." Supreme Tianlan admitted frankly and said, "There's something I want to ask Xiao Ma. I wanted to see you too, but it's getting late, so I didn't go over to call you." Lu Chen nodded expressionlessly and said, "No wonder. But you probably left some traces on purpose last night. Otherwise Atsu, that stupid dog, wouldn't be able to detect your traces." Supreme Tianlan smiled and looked at the big black dog in the corner of the courtyard, saying, "Is this the dog that you always want to bring with you?" "It looks good." Lu Chen frowned and said, "It's okay. It's mainly because I've raised it for a long time and don't want to be separated again. You know, it's hard for us to completely trust someone as a shadow, and it's not easy to have a dog." Supreme Tianlan nodded and said, "You're right." Then he smiled and said, "This dog must have had some fortuitous encounter. It seems that it has awakened a demon beast bloodline and its grade is extraordinary. It seems to be a descendant of the heavenly wolf in the Great Snow Mountain." Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. His hands that were hanging by his side subconsciously clenched a little and then slowly loosened. Supreme Tianlan waved at him and gestured for him to come closer. Lu Chen came and sat down in front of him. Supreme Tianlan looked at him kindly and said, "How is it? Are you used to living here?" "It's pretty good. It's not like you don't know what I did in the past. What kind of life haven't I seen? Now that I have a house and food, it's not too comfortable," Lu Chen replied. "Yes." Supreme Tianlan smiled and thought for a moment before saying, "Ever since you came back, I've actually wanted to have a good chat with you. But it didn't seem appropriate at that time. Either there was an outsider or I had something urgent to do and didn't have time. Today I finally have some spare time. How are you? Nothing urgent, right?" Lucian shook his head and said, "Of course I'm fine. But you're a soul formation perfected lord, why do you have to talk to me so much? Just tell me to do something." Supreme Tianlan stared at him and didn't seem to be angered by his words. He just smiled gently and said, "It's been so many years and we've been apart more than together. There are even fewer opportunities for us to really chat. Sometimes I feel that there's an indescribable barrier between us, right?" Lucian didn't say anything, but his hands in his sleeves slowly clenched. "Why is that?" Supreme Tianlan seemed to be a little regretful and emotional. "You're a talent that I've cultivated and I've always valued you. Of course, the task that I asked you to do more than 10 years ago was too difficult and dangerous. But you're really more outstanding than I thought and did a better job than I imagined. I'm really gratified and happy." Supreme Tianlan looked at Lucian sadly and said, "So, can you tell me why you seem to be a little wary of me? Tell me, will you?" This gentle and bald divine transformation stage perfected lord sat in front of Lucian like a towering mountain as he spoke to him. Chapter 402. Why was that? Lucian lowered his gaze and looked at the ground in front of him. A few stalks of tender grass poked their heads out of the soil, as if they were looking at the world curiously. They were completely unaware of the unimaginable hardships and suffering that existed in the distance outside. When did they become estranged? Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him calmly and even spoke with a hint of sincerity. This was a rare thing for a perfected lord of the divine transformation realm. From this, it could be seen that Lucian was indeed different from others in his eyes. Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "All these years I don't remember lying to you about anything, whether it was when you were in the devil cult or later when you left the devil cult to hide your tracks. As long as it's something I promised you, I remember I've done it all, right? To be honest, I've never lied to you, so I've always been puzzled. Why do you feel estranged from me?" At this point, Perfected Lord Tianlan sighed softly and said, "I know, you should be a little dissatisfied with me, but it's not too serious, at least not to the point of falling out with me. In the past few years, as long as I asked, although you would scold me from time to time, such as damn baldy, and so on, you would still help me in the end. So I think the friendship between the two of us should still exist. But it's also because of this that I want to know, why do you feel dissatisfied with me? Did I do something wrong?" Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at Lucian and continued to ask straightforwardly. Lucian remained silent for a long time and Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be exceptionally patient. He kept waiting and looked at Lucian quietly. After a long time, Lucian suddenly said, "How old was I when you first met me?" Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment as if he didn't expect Lucian to suddenly ask this question. After pondering for a while, he said, "I remember that you should only be 4 or 5 years old at that time." Lucian nodded slowly and said, "I still remember what happened when I was young very clearly. Back then, when you found me and took me away, I was very grateful to you. I believed in you, loved you, respected you, and made up my mind to repay you." Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression was calm and it was impossible to tell if he was happy or sad. Lucian continued, "So, after you raised me up and taught me all my skills, you asked me to go to the evil cult to be that shadow. I didn't think too much and went. You've told me many things in the past and I remember them all." He glanced at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said with a smile, "All living beings in the world, righteousness, getting rid of evil for the people, going through fire and water. I really believed in these words more than 10 years ago." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment. The gentle smile had already disappeared from his eyes. However, the way he looked at Lucian still seemed to be flickering with a reserved gentleness. He said softly, "These are all righteous things. I don't know what you're thinking right now, but if you still want to believe in these words, it's fine. These words, these principles, are not wrong," he said calmly. Lucian looked up at him and suddenly sneered. "Do you believe it yourself?" This time, it was Perfected Lord Tianlan's turn to be silent. However, his silence was much shorter than Lucian's. After a while, he suddenly sighed and didn't directly answer Lucian's question. Instead, he said with some emotions, "It's been many years since someone dared to question me like this." Lucian didn't say anything. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him for a while and suddenly smiled. "Actually, it's not very important whether I believe it or not. Even if I say what I think, you might not believe me if you're prejudiced against me, right?" He paused for a moment before continuing, "I'm just doing what I think I should do and what I want to do. After so many years, I can only say that I have a clear conscience." "Are you satisfied with this answer?" Lucian smiled and didn't reply either. Perfected Lord Tianlan said again, I've answered your question. What about the question I asked you before? Why do you seem to be dissatisfied with me? Lu Chen was silent for a moment before saying, You've done almost everything you promised me before. I admit that. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded. Lu Chen continued, When I was a shadow in the fiend cult, there were countless difficulties and dangers. However, I didn't think too much about it. At that time, I was probably thinking about completing the mission you gave me and contributing to the righteous path of the world. That was the only way I could persevere. You did well, very well. Perfected Lord Tianlan said. Later on, when I was done with my mission and returned, you arranged for me to hide in that small village. Lu Chen said indifferently, In that village I saw the lives of some ordinary people. At a certain time in a certain year, I suddenly thought of something. Perfected Lord Tianlan raised his brows slightly. What is it? Lu Chen said, Why did you choose me when you were young? Perfected Lord Tianlan hesitated for a moment before replying frankly, That's because you're talented enough. For someone of my status, if you weren't so talented, you wouldn't have attracted my attention. Lu Chen nodded. That's because I was lucky. However, after more than 10 years, when I was tortured by the black flame curse in that small village, I suddenly had a thought when I saw the children running around and playing games all day long. I wanted to ask you. Perfected Lord Tianlan asked, What do you want to ask? Lu Chen said, If I didn't go to the fiend cult to be a shadow, what would I be like now? He looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and asked calmly, Why didn't you take me in as your disciple? My talent and innate talent are clearly better than countless people. In terms of temperament, I respected you greatly and would definitely not do anything disobedient. Why didn't you give me a peaceful and smooth life? The muscles on Perfected Lord Tianlan's wide cheeks seemed to twitch slightly, but he still listened to Lu Chen expressionlessly. Lu Chen retracted his gaze and looked at the grass on the ground in front of him. He said lightly, I've been to your Kunlun party and even hung around there for a long time. Therefore, I can confidently tell you that if you had taken me in as your disciple back then, I would definitely have achieved more than the bunch of trash in the Kunlun party today. If that's the case, why did you still want me to go to the fiend cult? I've never been able to figure this out. Lu Chen said. Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at Lu Chen quietly. After a while, he said, I asked you to go to the fiend cult because no one in the world is more suitable than you. So, you'd rather me risk my life for more than 10 years and even suffer from the black flame curse for many years after escaping? Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head and said, Your sacrifice is worth it. Lu Chen suddenly smiled and said, If I told you that I didn't want to sacrifice and wanted to go to the Kunlun party to live and cultivate in peace, I think I would be stronger than the few most powerful people in the young generation of your Kunlun party. But you have never given me this opportunity. Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned as if he didn't know what to say for a moment. However, Lu Chen didn't seem to let it go. He even leaned forward and got closer to Perfected Lord Tianlan. He stared into his eyes and said slowly, So, after thinking about it, it seems that what you asked me to do is not for the righteousness of the world, but for yourself, right? Is it? Lu Chen asked. At this moment, the atmosphere in the courtyard suddenly became tense after he asked that question. No one spoke again. Even Atsu, who was hiding at the side, seemed to feel something and shrank his head. Chapter 403. Perfected Lord Tianlan remained silent for a long time. During this time he had been staring at Lu Chen. It seemed that after such a long time, it was the first time that he had discovered something about Lu Chen that he didn't know or hadn't discovered yet. His eyes looked very strange and complicated, as if there were many emotions mixed together. It was as if one could see all kinds of joy, anger, confusion, and so on. However, when one looked closely, one would feel that there was actually a deep sea in the depths of his eyes. It was deep and vast, but there was nothing in it. It was so deep that one couldn't see the bottom. Perhaps there was no one in this world who could see through his heart. At least Lu Chen couldn't. After a long time, Perfected Lord Tianlan slowly opened his mouth and broke the silence that had enveloped the surroundings for a long time. His tone was still calm, but the gentle and cheerful tone that he often used when talking to Lu Chen was gone. He became flat. I didn't expect that you would say such things to me. When Perfected Lord Tianlan said this, he shook his head slightly and looked disappointed. It's okay to suspect me, but it's stupid to criticize me to my face. I had high hopes for you. You did exceptionally well in the matter of the devil cult back then. Even I couldn't find any fault with you. But now, what good does it do for you to criticize me to my face? You can't even think through such a simple matter. Have you become stupid after living in seclusion for the past 10 years? When he said the last few words, perfected Lord Tianlan's expression even became a little stern. Lu Chen smiled. It seemed that in front of this powerful perfected Lord of the divine transformation realm, he really didn't have much fear. He looked at perfected Lord Tianlan and said lazily, "Why? I just said a few words and you're already anxious?" Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head helplessly again. "I'm not anxious. I'm just a little disappointed with the way you handled this matter." Lu Chen suddenly said, "If you don't like me then just send me away." A hint of anger flashed across perfected Lord Tianlan's face. After a moment of silence he stood up abruptly. However, just as he was about to walk to the door, he suddenly paused and looked back at Lu Chen with a frown. Then, the anger on his face suddenly dissipated and he slowly said with a smile, "Why do I suddenly feel that you've been trying to provoke me intentionally or unintentionally?" Lu Chen's hands hung by his side. He slowly clenched his fists in his sleeves, but his palms were already covered in cold sweat. However, this did not affect his expression. He lowered his head slightly and put on a submissive expression again. "There is no such thing." Looking at Lu Chen, perfected Lord Tianlan's expression gradually turned gentle again. There seemed to be a few more emotions in his eyes. There was a hint of mockery but also a hint of gratification and happiness. "Where's little Ma?" Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly changed the topic, as if he did not want to continue talking about this with Lu Chen. Lu Chen secretly heaved a sigh of relief, but his expression did not change much. He said, "He went to Fuyunji to look for Hall Master Shuiying for money." "For money?" Perfected Lord Tianlan thought for a moment and then nodded. "Oh, it's that matter. Shuiying did mention it to me. I say, aren't the two of you a little too greedy? Although that matter might cost a lot of money, isn't it a little too much to ask for so much all at once? No wonder Shuiying came to complain to me indignantly." Lu Chen's expression did not change. He quickly continued, "It's easier to do things with money. Only then can things be done quickly and well." Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered and said, "Nonsense. You can't fool anyone with this. Who came up with the idea of this price? You or little Ma?" Lu Chen did not hesitate to shift the blame to perfected Lord Tianlan. "Ma Xiaoyan said it." "Him?" Perfected Lord Tianlan looked a little doubtful. He took another look at Lu Chen and said, "Why do I feel that it's more like your idea?" Lu Chen said seriously, "I've been living a poor life for so many years. I've long gotten used to it. Money is also a worldly possession to me. I don't care about it." Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed a little stunned. He said, "You're that nice?" Lu Chen nodded solemnly and said, "Yes." Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at him for a moment and suddenly laughed. He then sighed and said, "I understand. I'll talk to Shuiying later. I'll give you 10,000. Lu Chen raised his eyebrows and said, "Old Ma asked for 30,000? That's more like it." Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted and said, "Fuyunji's money doesn't come from the wind. What's more, there are so many eyes in Zhengxianming staring at us. They can't wait to take back every spirit stone we spend and check it carefully. We're already giving you face by giving you 10,000, okay?" "Okay, thank you." Lu Chen immediately changed his stance and nodded to express his thanks. Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment and then shook his head with a smile. He then pondered for a moment and took out a piece of white paper from his bosom and handed it to Lu Chen. Lu Chen took it and roughly glanced at it. He saw that there were many words written on the white paper. The contents recorded the names of many people and their respective identities, residences, personalities, and even the level of their cultivation. "What's this?" Lu Chen looked up and asked Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "In the past few years, we've specially investigated a group of people. We've gotten rid of those who have solid evidence of colluding with the devil cult. But there are still some people we're not sure about. We have some suspicions but we don't have any evidence, so it's really hard to deal with them. Since you're here to do that, you might be able to investigate from among these people as well." Lu Chen glanced at the name list on the white paper and then nodded and said, "I'll go find them." "Okay." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him one last time and then turned to leave. From the beginning to the end, they never mentioned the barrier that they once argued about, as if the problem had never existed. Old Ma only came back in the afternoon when it was almost dusk. He looked very happy. When he entered the door, he had a calm expression on his face as if nothing had happened. At least in the eyes of outsiders, there was nothing unusual. However, when he walked into the house and closed the door, the serious expression on his face immediately disappeared. Not only was he full of joy, he even strode to the backyard while laughing and shouting, "Lu Qin, Lu Qin! Come out quickly. I have great news to tell you." Lu Qin, who was sitting in the courtyard, turned around and looked very calm. He said with a smile, "So happy? It seems to be good news." Old Ma nodded repeatedly. When he was about to say something, he suddenly looked around and said with a little surprise, "Hey, where's Atsu? He just ate a big piece of meat and went back to sleep." Alright, he really is a dog that sleeps better than a pig." Old Ma walked over with a smile and sat opposite Lu Qin. He said, "Quick guess, what did I get from looking for Shuang?" Lu Qin thought for a while and said thoughtfully, "She agreed to give you money?" Old Ma snorted and said with a smug look on his face, "Isn't that obvious? The question is, how many exactly? Why don't you guess? Quick, quick." Lu Qin also laughed and said, "About 5,000. After all, if we ask for a sky-high price, Shuang will have to pay us back fiercely." Old Ma slapped his thigh and said proudly, "Wrong. More than that." Lu Qin smiled with a hint of surprise and said, "More than that? Amazing, Old Ma, you can even deal with Shuang. Quick, tell me, how much did you give?" 10,000. Old Ma said proudly. "Amazing, amazing." Lu Qin laughed and said, "We're rich." Chapter 404. After nightfall, Old Ma, who had gotten the biggest windfall in his life, finally went back to his room to sleep contentedly. During the period of returning just now, Old Ma pulled Lu Qin and talked a lot. He showed great longing and yearning for the decadent life that was about to unfold in the immortal city. Old Ma's attitude surprised Lu Qin a little. Although 10,000 spirit stones was indeed a huge sum of money, and most of the poor rogue cultivators with no family background might not see so much money in their lifetime, Old Ma was someone who had been with a soul formation cultivator for many years. He also had the support of Zhang Xianming and Fiyunji, the most powerful hall in Zhang Xianming. No matter what, he shouldn't be so excited, right? Usually, when we were in Qingshitang village, you were always calmer. Old Ma snorted at Lu Chen's words and refuted them without hesitation. True, Lord Tianlan is naturally one of the top immortals in the world, but I have been with him for a long time. Our identities are too different. I'm just a small spy, what special benefits can I get? Zhang Xianming is indeed a towering tree, but few people in Zhang Xianming know my identity, okay? What benefits can I get? I have a good relationship with Fiyunji, but recently you've been giving hall leader Shuang a hard time and asked me to go over to ask for money. Cutting off people's income is like killing their parents, do you know that? She has already chased me out once. Now I'm very worried that I might die mysteriously on the side of the road with no one to collect my corpse. So after saying so much, I'm very miserable. I'm basically a rogue cultivator with no family background. In this situation, it's not strange for me to be excited when I see this huge sum of money, right? Lu Qin thought about it and nodded. Yes, you're right. I didn't think so at first, but after hearing what you said, I suddenly feel that these 10,000 spirit stones are too good. It's worth celebrating. Old Ma laughed out loud and his excitement was obvious. He patted Lu Chen's shoulder and said, "Then tomorrow we will go to spend." No, tomorrow we will go to work. He quickly corrected his expression and said seriously. Lu Qin said, "All right." Old Ma chuckled, then turned around and walked towards his bedroom. However, after taking a few steps, he suddenly turned around to look at Lu Qin and said, "Hey, you seem a little strange." Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat, but he smiled and said calmly, "What's strange? I'm fine." Old Ma looked him up and down, and a trace of surprise flashed across his eyes. Lu Qin was secretly shocked. He thought to himself, does this guy really have some hidden skills? How can he detect traces of perfected Lord Tianlan's previous visit? Old Ma observed him for a while and suddenly said, "Lu Qin, why don't you look excited at all?" Lu Qin was startled and said, "Excited? Do I need to be excited?" Old Ma said, "I remember when you lived with me in Qingshitang village, you often scolded me for a few pieces of spirit stones. Why don't you have any reaction now that we have this huge sum of 10,000 spirit stones?" Lu Qin heaved a sigh of relief and said with a smile, "I thought you were going to say something. I was bored in that stupid village, so I was just playing with you. It's just 10,000 spirit stones, I don't care about it." Just. Old Ma paused and looked at him with disdain. He shook his head and said, "Pretentious, you just like to pretend." With a disdainful look on his face, he obviously did not believe Lu Chen's words at all. He then walked back slowly. Lu Chen couldn't help but laugh. After watching him return to his room, he looked up at the darkening sky and returned to his own room. There was a candle in the bedroom. Lucian lit it and sat down at the table. Atsu was lying on the floor and sleeping soundly. Lucian couldn't help but smile when he saw its appearance. He walked over and rubbed its head. Its fur was soft and it gave off a warm aura. At that moment, his eyes suddenly became a little blank as if he was looking at an unknown place. Even his voice became a little hollow. In this room there was only himself and Atsu, who was sleeping soundly. After a long time he could only hear him mumbling softly to himself. From day to night, the words spoken by people are mixed with lies. Atsu, can you tell if I'm telling the truth or not? His eyes finally fell on the candle flame that was burning silently. The faint yellow light was reflected in his pupils, burning silently. I've been a shadow since I was a child, and I've been a shadow for too long, Atsu. Atsu was sleeping soundly. Maybe it was dreaming of something delicious because its mouth was making a series of grunting sounds. Lucian looked down at it, his eyes calm and gentle, and said softly, Atsu, I seem to have gotten used to lying. I'm always lying, I'm always pretending to be something else. Sometimes I don't even know what my real face looks like. He slightly lowered his head, and the candlelight fell on the side of his face, making it look dark and uncertain. So, his voice seemed to be a little sad, a little emotional, a little disappointed and yearning, as if he was thinking of something that happened a long time ago. If only Exian was still here, right, Atsu? She's so stupid I don't even need to lie to her, hee. He chuckled softly, but at the end there was a bit of sadness in his voice. He quietly said so. The next morning when the sun was shining, Old Ma woke up from his dream early. After tidying up, he went out and walked to Lu Chen's bedroom. He knocked on the door and shouted loudly, Hey, wake up, wake up. Today's weather is so good, it's a good day to do something. After a while, a few grumbling and somewhat annoyed barks came from behind the closed door. Then a series of footsteps approached from afar. After a creak, Lu Chen opened the door and stood there. He even yawned and said, What are you doing? The sun just rose, isn't it? It's too early for you to be up. What do you mean by early? Old Ma glared at him, showing a deep hatred for Lu Chen's lazy habits. He said seriously, We have to do something big for the sake of the world, for justice and for the sake of the world. How can we be lazy? Quickly wash up, change your clothes and tidy up, we'll go out to do something. Lu Chen was a little surprised. He looked up and down at Old Ma and said, It's only been one night, why do you seem to be different from the past 10 years? It's like you've changed into a different person. Old Ma spat and said, I used to hang out with you in that godforsaken mountain village. I didn't have any motivation at all. But now it's different, we're in Immortal City, this is a great opportunity. Lu Chen interrupted, The main thing is that you have money, right? This is when, no, the main thing is that you have the opportunity to do something big. Old Ma corrected Lu Chen's wrong point of view in time. Lu Chen didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He waved his hand and said, Okay, wait for me, I'll be out soon. Hurry up. Old Ma paced back and forth in the yard. After a while he saw Lu Chen coming out of the room. He poked his head out and glanced at Lu Chen's bedroom. Seeing that Atsu was still lying there with sleepy eyes, he couldn't help but say, If we go out like this for a day and leave Atsu alone at home, will there be an accident? It'll be fine. Lu Chen walked to the storeroom, opened the door, and brought back a large piece of demon beast meat. He put it next to Atsu, then walked out and said to Old Ma, It's growing recently, so it can't wait to eat, drink, and sleep every day. It won't want to go out. My goodness, it's still growing at this age? Old Ma exclaimed. Yes. Lu Chen looked back and said faintly, I only found out last night. It seems that Atsu is going to advance again. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.